Varn. I love that new intro, by the way. Your mic is off, eh? Looks like.
All right, welcome to Varn Vlog, and I'm here today with the host of Where Does Politics, and we're going to be talking about the strange realignment of virtues and orientations in the left-right world, and how it became muddled. And your thesis in a series of recent videos, I think there's 3 of them, there will be 3 of them. One is on the development of the Russian Social Democratic Party into the Bolsheviks. So, and particularly you and I have a complicated view of Plekhanov.
Okay.
I think ultimately he's kind of a villain, but I think some of the things he said about what they wanted to do in socialism were correct, and that leads me into like this weird way of trying to parse what actually happened with Plekhanov. So on one hand, I think he's right that the kind of socialism that the Marxists were promoting in Russia, coming from Germany, would have required a lot of development. It could have been bypassed if they had joined up with the West. And the West won. The Western Marxists and anarchists and whatever won. But because they didn't, and because he was skeptical of even trying, Plekhanov ends up like pushing this hyper bourgeois developmentalism.
Yeah.
Ultimately, after the revolution in Germany fails, Plekhanov's fear that you'd have really authoritarian bourgeois development through a form of state capitalism. He called it like Incan development,
Empire,
Empire
or whatever.
That happens. Like
for the reasons he said it would happen. It's one of those little prophetic passages, like Bakunin's stuff.
Yeah. Oh, he predicted saying Bakunin's right is going to make Marxists real mad.
Well, Bakunin, whatever. A lot of Bakunin is trash, but there's that. I like some Bakunin. A lot of it's trash, but there's that passage, of course, that he talked about. The people they're going to beat the people with the people's stick and all that.
Oh yeah. Well, this is the thing. Yeah, this is the thing I was thinking about, because I've been obsessed recently with the history of Maoism, and if you think that USSR is blatantly contradictory. Like looking at what's going on in the 60s and 70s in China, where on one hand, China is developing, actually trying to do things in critique of the program that no socialist countries actually tried to do. Like labor tokens, balancing out rural and urban development, etc. Yeah. And while everyone always talks about the great decreases of poverty under Deng, if you actually look at Chinese like developments of increasing life expectancy, of rural education, etc., it actually comes from the Cultural Revolution period and right before and right after.
Oh wow!
And that's just ignored. However, at the same time, China's doing shit like helping Cambodia try to get revenge on Vietnam and trying to pump up the Khmer Rouge with the aid of the United States.
Yeah.
It is China doesn't cut Chile out after the Pinochet coup, and actually is nice to Pinochet until he dies.
Yeah. Why?
Just to piss off the Soviets, because, and if you actually look at like three worlds theory and 70s Chinese theoretical conceptions, and by that time you're like, what does this have to do with Marxism anyway? But people think, oh, the first world's the capitalist world, and the second world's the Soviet bloc, and then the third world is the non-aligned movement. That's not what it actually says. That's how people revised it in the 80s.
Yeah.
What it said at the time is the first world is the USSR and the United States, and the USSR is actually the bigger enemy. Now, it's really funny now because you have all these Marxist Leninists who's like, we have to defend, the USSR and Stalin, but we also need to defend Deng and actually existing socialism in China and Cuba, etc. And I have a soft spot for Cuba, but
look, there's stuff, local democracy in Cuba is better than it is in, Canada and the US. So they got something.
But this idea that like we have to defend the Soviet Union, when I'm like, but you're citing works and documents that were actually more aimed at critiquing the Soviet Union than they even were aimed at critiquing the capitalist world.
People are always screaming on my comments. I made this, my new episode was just about equity, language, and identity politics, and somehow I get all these Stalinists screaming at me in the comments, and they're telling me, they're always like, oh, well, it's always because of capitalist encirclement, and they had to become authoritarian because they're always being attacked. Every non-Marxist-Leninist socialist state failed and was crushed. And I was like, yeah, crushed by the USSR. If you make the list of all the attempts at actual socialism made by states, some of them were put down by the US, like Chile especially, but every other one was put down by the USSR. Georgia, Hungary, anarchist Spain, sort of, you could say was put down by the USSR, Czechoslovakia, come on. Anyways.
Yeah, well, the encirclement thesis is also interesting when you like remember that in the 70s you're literally having Marxist-Leninists fight other Marxist-Leninists in countries that were previously engaged with fighting the US, and that those battles are actually just as bloody or bloodier and lead to resentment to this day. Like, why is there tensions between China and Vietnam even now? Like, because on paper, slightly market liberalized communist economies, why are they so hostile to each other? Why is Vietnam now totally willing to appeal to the US all the time to kind of deal with itself in claims made by China over the South China Sea, which is something that I have noticed for a long time. It's not because this is an ideological battle between communists and capitalists.
They're just fighting them off the Chinese imperialism,
right?
Western imperialism as a counterbalance.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's interesting, and also like the idea that China isn't totally integrated into the capitalist world is interesting to me. Yes, actually, it's become slightly more less so in the past 10 years. It's done a lot of development in Africa, and it has been more responsible and less imperialistic than the West. Absolutely true, but it's an awfully low standard.
Yeah, like, I don't know. It's I still have that basic Noam Chomsky stuff. The way when I look at these countries, and it's just the people who are defending Maoism and Marxist-Leninism want to be. They don't like things the way they are because they're the sort of downwardly mobile upper middle class, and they want to be the new ruling class in one of those states. Like that's how they see themselves. So they're willing to defend. Part of it is just desperation, feeling like there's no hope to get out of the system we are, and that those systems, there was a change. They were successful in the sense that they established an alternative type of political system. So there's that, but there's also like, I want to be the new elite. I see myself in those shoes. I see myself as that, and that's it. They're just going to defend anything that Stalin does. There's always an excuse. It might as well be QAnon theory or flat Earth theory or lizard people theory. It's religious. It's just, I want to be that new elite. That's it. And that's why it's so popular. Shockingly, I was actually surprised by this, but apparently in Ivy League academia now, Maoism and Marxist-Leninism have made a huge comeback, just like they've made sort of everywhere. People are really into that, and that makes perfect sense. Like those are the people who want to be in the Communist Party elite, and who want every excuse to suppress freedom of speech and freedom of everything else, because we don't need freedom of speech when I'm in charge, because I do everything great. They're like the caricatures of communism that you'll hear from Jordan Peterson. That those people are that. Well,
this is lead to part of my theory on the Great Confusion and liberal anti-communism. I call it the Great Confusion because even though socialism in the aught teens became slightly more popular in America, you know, where like 40% would talk about it and like 6% of people would be like, well, you know, we can have a socialist candidate or whatever. That's declined recently, and I've been pointing this out that like
has it?
Positive views of socialism in the United States have actually declined, not precipitously. What's interesting is during the same time period, popularity of capitalism has declined even more.
Oh yeah,
which
makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but that should scare people, because if socialism is not popular and capitalism is not popular, the other options historically are
very,
all
very bad.
You know, they're like monarchism, fascism.
But that's what we're seeing, is because, and this is why I started my whole series in the first place, right? Is you have that identity politics stuff, the liberal phony identity politics stuff that ordinary people correctly perceive as a threat and an attack on them. And so they're afraid, and they think, oh, that's the left because Fox News says it's the left. So I must be on the right. You know, normal apolitical people, not like total nerds like us who are totally, you know, reading everything and understand what all these words mean. Ordinary people think, oh, the stuff that scares me and that doesn't let me talk and think through my ideas, that's the left. So I don't like the left. I must be on the right. The guy who's fighting those people that are scaring me is Donald Trump. So I must like Donald Trump, and he must be defending me. Ron DeSantis must be defending me. And then you have these guys like Chris Rufo who speak well and speak to those kind of fears, and it just legitimizes the whole thing. And now you have so many people, and I see this in Canada, people who never would have supported a right-wing candidate in their lives, would never even considered it, are like voting for the Conservative Party, voting for Donald Trump or Pierre Poilievre in Canada, who's like an intellectual he's the real deal. Like Donald Trump is a dum-dum and a disaster and just a giant baby. Thankfully, he was too incompetent to do anything real. Well, Pierre Poilievre is the intellectual version of Donald Trump that is the nightmare scenario. And people like him because he knows how to speak to those fears. And so I want people to realize, like, no, that's not both of these things. That liberal shit is not the left. It's the liberal right, you know, and the conservative shit is conservative right. They're both right-wing politics aimed at dividing and dominating the working class, and left is something else, you know.
I think this is actually an important thing to kind
Same for communism. That fake communism was a right-wing ideology draped in red flags, draped in the words of socialism, just like this liberal fake stuff is just right-wing race politics draped in the language of intersectionality and anti-racism and you know, women's rights, etc.
Well, so I want to talk about, we'll get into both of that a little bit. I mean, we talked with the kind of cautionary tale of Plekhanov, and one of the things you discovered that I did not even know is so there's the infamous Vera Sirlik letters, which is where Marx actually posits another way out for Russian development based off the commune, and not because it, like, the idea is, well, capitalism had to happen somewhere, but you don't necessarily have to go through it. So like, and he said he suppresses those letters himself, but they're actually yes. He doesn't send them because he keeps on rewriting what he.
Yeah.
Right.
He sent her the most timid. He writes, and also I mean, your audience is super knowledgeable, but in case there's people who are less knowledgeable, Plekhanov was one of the early Marxist socialists in Russia who he was very much against the peasantry and wanted this industrial type of socialism, and he suppressed Marx's writings about how there might be a peasant road to socialism, basically. But what he did that was excellent is that he really predicted that if you try to have socialism, the kind of urban socialism that he wanted in a peasant country, you're just going to have some horrible dictatorship that's not worth the name socialism. And he predicted that, and that's exactly what happened for the reasons that he predicted. So sorry.
Yeah. I think this is actually really important. One of the things that I've seen all these defenses of dung out of Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. When I used to kind of admire Maoists because, like, Maoism 20 years ago meant you hated China, believe it or not. And not because I think people should hate China, but, like, there was this... it used to mean you rejected the Dengist reforms, right? And I don't think people know how liberalizing the Dengist reforms were, and liberalizing here in the bad sense. He cut back on rural schooling significantly. He cut back on any form of socialized healthcare, particularly for the rural areas. You saw a restoration of urban privilege and elite, actually, in a lot of ways. He actually encouraged denouncing the Russification period as a period of anti-intellectualism, which wasn't true. What they were trying to do with Russification was to take skills of urban areas and spread them out amongst the countryside by placing those people there. The end of barefoot doctors led to a stalling in life expectancy. So life expectancy in China, despite whatever you think happened in the Cultural Revolution and the violence of it, was rising precipitously. And it stalls out for 15 years after the Deng reforms. What you start seeing is China develops a Gini coefficient higher than the West for a long time. It only came down around 2014 to like... above Europe, but below U.S. levels.
Because why?
Because Xi actually was in 2012.
There's more. I mean, there's been more labor activity in the last 10 years. There's been crazy labor riots and.
Yeah, you're right. There have been... the most intense period of labor activity actually was a little over 10 years ago. It was 11 years ago.
Okay.
But there was also... there was that, plus there was stuff going on in the countryside. Like, there was all kinds of, like...
Is it did Deng institute the policy where basically rural people are serfs, like where they're trapped in their area and they can't leave? That under Mao before him.
So the Hukao system was developed under Mao, but the idea that it was used to, quote, stop the development of a lumpen proletariat in the cities... that the change in its use was under Deng. And another thing Deng did, while yeah, there was all kinds of like speech announcements and all kinds of crazy stuff during the Cultural Revolution, often got quite violent. Technically and formally, you had freedom of speech in China.
Right.
Deng officially reverses that.
Okay.
So
I mean, Stalin officially had freedom of speech too. If
right.
you the Soviet Constitution, it's awesome. Any social democratic state would be proud of that beautiful Constitution. Yeah.
Well, this is why, you know, one of the things I've noticed about MLs, if they're often right about what these states said they were doing, although, I mean, my favorite one, though, about the Soviet constitutions in the 1930s, they literally put something in that Marx said you should never do in Critique of the Goethe program formally in the Constitution itself.
Okay.
But that's a kind of fun one. But
what was it exactly? Do you remember?
Oh, it was something about labor producing value and what is it? It was you were entitled to the work you put in like this direct way that was what he critiqued in LaSalle. Like, it's just straight up in the Constitution. But in general, like, the Soviet Constitution was not bad. There was a division of powers. I mean, we forget, like, the Soviet Union had a president that wasn't Stalin, but do you remember his name?
Yeah.
Like it's and that's because party control was so thorough. Now, in addition to the things that I think that were kind of like the original developmental sins, like not acknowledging the problems with the German Revolution, failing, not helping or trying to heal the division with the Social Democrats. In fact, what you see increasingly, starting with the 1918 program and I think it's the 21 conditions to join the Comintern, which splits every communist socialist party on the planet, automatically causes a split because there's like these requirements to regularly purge people and whatnot.
Well, that's the USSR
Yep, it is. It actually is
for that purpose, basically. Like, they just, at that point, they were just like, okay, the Comintern has to be a tool of our imperialism, basically, at this point. It has to serve our needs because we are the revolution and we are socialism. Like, that's what.
Right, and what was interesting about that is, of course, they were going to get a privileged seat at the table, being the first revolution that actually, like, popped off and didn't turn bourgeois like, say, the Mexican Revolution did. But they kept on using it as a way to instantiate their foreign policy, and it wasn't just Stalin. Zinoviev was awful about this stuff.
I mean, Lenin was developing that idea as well, like while he was still functioning properly. That was his idea.
And then you get like the Soviet Union being unable to tell which side of a debate they should be siding on. So like Karl Radek, who's associated with the left opposition, like, and is purged, but he ends up like at one point praising a bunch of like these German socialists who are proto-Nazis. So like they're either intervening in context they don't entirely understand, and they cause a lot of these socialist parties to split. I mean, the Socialist Party of America, which was a shit show in a lot of ways, but as I like to point out, voted the right way in World War I. That splits. It goes into the Communist Party. The Communist Party, like, weirdly during third periodism actually ends up being useful because they take an anti-racist response because they reject any collaboration with bourgeois parties. But the moment it becomes politically inconvenient after 1936, and then definitely when they reverse the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact when Hitler attacks in the early 40s, you see this shift to suppressing like this multiracial coalition that they've been building, while also trying to support the Black community as like a bulwark of the ability to like break up the U.S. basically. And it leads them into these bizarro contradictions where they're telling Black people to suppress themselves so that they can stay in league with Democrats who have a large minority who are active segregationists and proto neoliberals. Like,
wow.
And what's even funnier about that to me is that had happened before. Like, so when William Jennings Bryan gives up on the Populist Party and enters the Democratic Party in the late 19th, early 20th century, that's even harder to justify because at that time, you are entering effectively the right-wing party of the United States. The Democrats were not at all the party of the more progressive and the bourgeoisie. So, like, that starts that trend.
Period, but there was that. I mean, they were closer to the populists than the Republicans were at that period. No, in that
sort of,
they were super racist. They were the racist party. They were the racist party, but they were also the I forget, I'm mixed up with the time periods, but they were more, you know, if you weren't going to vote populist, you were going to vote Democrat, not Republican.
Depends on where you're at. So they represented from like my kind of more strict Marxist class analysis. They represented the petite bourgeoisie, the remains of the planter class, basically everybody who wasn't the big bourgeoisie,
the big industrialists,
right? Okay. And in this time period, you could argue the big industrialists were the more progressive power as far as like what they actually wanted, but right, because it wasn't like that the Democrats wanted a lot of social programs or whatever. They were just but what that led to was this kind of like the interesting thing about the parties in the United States, they're both bourgeois parties, but like the Democrats have always been a weird collection of different interest groups that have never been totally coherent.
Right. Yeah.
And the Republicans tend to be productive industry and big industrial industry, and also petty bourgeoisie who want low taxes. What's been interesting in the last 30 years, as far as like where the class base of these classes go, is the big industrialists that were tied to to the Republican Party pretty much lost the battle in like capital development after the 1970s, and the Democrats become more aligned with like corporate rentierism. So I would say like urban finance and tech capital and stuff
But
like that.
That's whole stupid globalist versus nationalist crap. Like the
Right.
Republicans should be aligned with industries that are more local based, national based, that still have some, not necessarily labor in the U.S., but have a lot of their operations centered in the U.S., while the Democrats tend to be the ones who are more global in operation, headquartered in the U.S. and all that stuff. And that's where a lot of those cultural differences come from, and that's where you have that hate. It's perverted into this messed up globalist versus nationalist narrative, which is just, again, two kinds of right wings fighting each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one thing I've been pushing for understanding. Like, I'm like, the American left is tailing two different forms of right-wing reaction, and they have two different class bases, but they're both capitalist. And what is interesting right now is there's been some subtle changes. Like I've been pointing out, like, for example, what kept a lot of the quote red states unquote together was military Keynesianism, which was like all this investment in the military that went into people. And that manifested as a poverty draft, but it also manifested like all these manufacturing jobs to support military contractors and whatnot, and people to service and help those cities. And that kept a lot of the southern cities and actually functional after deindustrialization. In around 2005, 2006, for the beginning of drone warfare, that all dries up. And so the whole left behind feeling of like exurban and rural America gets exacerbated dramatically by the end of that kind of backdoor military social programs that have been kind of holding everything together. And then on top of that, deindustrialization hollows out the upper Midwest and finishes off. I mean, the South was never super industrialized. That's something that I think people don't entirely understand. But finishes off the South, which also means that it's like thoroughly in this like petit bourgeois like orientation. And in these areas, like I was actually just reading Marx and Engels like talking about how mad they were when the Socialist Party like backed tariffs for protection in Germany, which I don't think people realize how big they were opposed to that, because I thought it was a barrier to internationalisal.
Interesting. Okay, no, I didn't know.
But
we should get back to the Zasalich when we finish. We should get back to the Zasalich letter when you.
Sorry, we're like going all the way around. So Zasalich letter though.
Let me just explain quickly what it is, right? So this one of Plekhanov's disciples, they were the core Marxist group in Russia, writes to Marx and basically is asking him about Plekhanov's idea. Like, basically, because you had the populist socialists in Russia who believed in some kind of agrarian road to socialism, and then you had the Marxists. And she was asking him what he thought basically of both of those positions. So the populist socialist position was, well, we don't need to industrialize, or we don't need to go through capitalism in Russia, because we have this peasant commune. The peasants already are sort of commune in their orientation and their organization. We just need to overthrow the government so that communism can express itself, and then they can, federate and join and have some kind of, we can industrialize slowly, but basically have some kind of socialist society rooted in the agricultural communism that exists at that time. Or, like Plekhanov insists, and what became the Mensheviks insist, and basically the Bolsheviks too, more or less, that, well, no, we have to industrialize first. You can't have any sort of communism based on peasants. Peasants are too backwards. You can't have any kind of communism or socialism without heavy industrialization. So we have to just give up on the peasants entirely, and maybe even support their being uprooted in that process of proletarianization, because that's what's going to get us communism in the end. And surprisingly, to previously Marx had advocated that sort of the peasants are doomed to be destroyed. The peasants are a backwards force. The peasants are petit bourgeois. But he had started to change his mind around that time because he started to he learned Russian and started to do research about a lot of heavy statistical books about Russia at that time, which had been coming out. And he had a friend in Russia who was feeding him all this stuff. And he changed his mind basically in his private notes. He seemed to have really changed his mind about that and thought that not only was it possible to have socialism based on the peasant commune, but that there's a better chance of socialism emerging in a country like Russia that is economically backwards and not industrialized than there is of it emerging in the West, which is in his earlier works, or his big works, Capital, for example. He was certain that you could only have socialism in the most industrialized countries. So he was expecting socialism to come in Germany, England, Netherlands, but not in a place like Russia. But by the end of his life, he was thinking, well, maybe Russia even has a better chance of socialism than the West. And in this letter to Zaslish, but somehow he was very conservative about advertising this change of thought. He was very insecure about it, maybe because he was embarrassed that he had changed his mind because he had been such a dick about it when he was young. A poster.
I mean, it's part of the Bakunin Marx debates is like, we can't deal with the peasantry.
Yep, I think he was embarrassed to change his opinions on that. And also maybe he just wasn't certain, but whatever it is, so he responds. So she's asking, what's what, which, who's right? And Marx, at first, he writes 4 drafts, and they get progressively less enthusiastic about the possibilities of peasant socialism. And it starts out like as 4 pages, and then the last one is just like half a page, basically, where he says, oh yeah, there sort of are some hopes of that, but we probably have to have revolution first in the West, and the Tsarism has to be overthrown, and it's kind of ambiguous and not super enthusiastic. But what's interesting is the previous drafts, where he's much more enthusiastic, and what's even more interesting is a lot of his private notes, where he's even more enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. Well, there's correspondence from Engels to Vera Sazulak too, and one of the interesting things that I think that I discovered recently is Engels decides after Marx's death to publish those letters. But then, as you found out, they're suppressed in Russia by Plekhanov, who's afraid. Plekhanov's idea, because apparently Marx wasn't the only person to have this idea. Concurrently, there were different people in Russia who were attached to the Narodniki, which kind of ends up being a nationalism.
He was basically adopting their position, more or less. Like, they had those ideas before Marx, basically, right. And he hopped on. I would say hopped on that train, but he kind of acknowledged their position against the Marxists.
What's interesting about that is you see some of that in Lenin. So Lenin's, for example, declaration of the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, as opposed to just the proletariat. But it is very clear in Lenin that he thinks the peasantry play a subordinate role, and he's only keeping them in because he has to.
Lenin never got to read these notes and letters from Marx because Plekhanov suppressed it, and also Engels wasn't very excited. I'm curious to tell me more about this correspondence.
Well, Engels was not excited about it.
No, he didn't like it either. Yeah.
Engels thought it was kind of a mistake, and I mean, if you look at what Lenin comes up with when they do try the revolution in Russia, it is sort of initially what Marx was arguing for. Like, yes, the peasant communes would be useful, but they can use materials in cooperation from socialists in the West to get the material stuff that they need.
Lenin adopted Trotsky's idea, basically, and their idea was different because they did not think that you could build socialism on the peasant commune except basically if there was communist revolution in the West, and then you could support all the technology and techniques and kind of just, they thought it was entirely based on that, which is not what Marx thought. And then I lost my train of thought. But never mind. Sorry, go on.
Well, I mean, Marx's answer.
Sorry, what I meant was what Lenin did that was smarter than the other Marxists at the time, and Trotsky also did, was that they realized that, well, there's this revolutionary potential in the peasants in the sense that they hate the government, they hate Tsarism more than anybody, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to work with that and use that, but we can't let them lead the show because there's no real revolutionary potential there. Only the proletariat has revolutionary potential, so we can harness that energy and sort of ride it like a surf like a surfboard to get to where we want to go, but we always have to keep them under our reins, which I think was this fatal mistake, which ended up destroying the revolution. And incidentally, we should talk about it too. I still need to read more about this to really consolidate this, but I'm getting the feeling that the reason that the communist revolutions failed, one of the big reasons that communism, because you had this wave of revolutions, after World War I all across Western Europe, communist revolutions from in Ireland, all the way to Germany and Hungary and the East. I think one of the big reasons those failed is because Lenin's party essentially went to war against the peasants early on before the NEP. I think that
that's the first Red Terror.
That news got to the West, and the peasants in the West were like, we don't want any of this shit. Like, they basically, a lot of the peasants in the West, especially not in the West, but in the Eastern, especially in the Eastern countries, which became the Eastern Bloc, but at that time they were not, like Hungary, and also Germany. They were very open to a lot of the socialist ideals, and they had socialist parties, or not party, but they had peasant parties that were developing ideas that were similar to peasant socialism in Russia as it had been developing. But they were so grossed out by the actions of the Bolsheviks, and then of course later Stalin, that they became big anti-communists and end up aligning with the fascists in a lot of cases. And I think that if you had them on board, or at least feeling more neutral about it, that you would have had a lot of those communist revolutions would have succeeded in the West. I think, ironically, the Bolsheviks fucked up communism in the West, which fucked up communism.
My pushback to that is the Mexican Revolution, because there you have what we would consider like Magonist fighting Zapatistas to support a bourgeois government, of which actually, ironically, the Zapatistas eventually get what they want, which is land reform, and the Magonists don't get anything. So I don't just think it's the Soviet Union. I think that's an overly simple explanation. I think one of the things you have to deal with is, like, one, Marx based his idea of the peasantry almost entirely off the peasantry in France until the very end of his life, because that was his only real experience of it outside of Germany, and he hadn't been in Germany for ever. And there really wasn't that much of a peasantry left in England, like that. So there's that. If you've ever read like the kind of hyper like the ultra leftists who kind of reject the workers' movement around endnotes, they actually do point out that like almost all the revolutions we saw, even in the late 20th century, were peasants' revolutions for national liberation, which then get liquidated into a national developmental regime that does more or less undo the peasantry. But that the peasantry then divides there between developmentalist and anti-communist almost immediately, which of course actually then confirms the communist saying, well, they were always reactionary in the first place, which you have this feedback loop that goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. In some ways, it's a harder question to deal with now, because it's like, well, there's still peasants in the world, but and in raw number, lots of them, but as a percentage of the population.
It's not. I wouldn't. I'm not talking about this stuff like sort of as to say, okay, we have to have the peasant road to socialism today. It's just because I really want to, the creeping Stalinism and Leninism, especially Stalinism, but even Leninism today, I think is dangerous. And we need to just look at the big mistakes they made and how they shot themselves in the foot and painted themselves into a corner. The more I read about Lenin, I'm like, okay, these weren't bad guys, they weren't necessarily evil people, but they painted themselves in a corner because they had some stupid ideas, and then they became bad people because they were cornered, and that's what happens to you. You want to survive, so, well, I'd rather enslave all these people than get killed, so that's where you end up going with that.
Well,
and I want the little people today who are worshiping those people to realize, like, no, there's they're the example of what's going to happen to you if you do this the wrong way, like they did. Let's look at the other ways. And I'm not saying that the peasant road to socialism isn't the way to go today, but the principles of that peasant road to socialism are, well, where's the majority of the population at? What do they need? And don't we need to have them on our side if we're going to have anything that's resembling socialism? So today, you have to convince the people that exist to your side. You can't just take over and have some horrible dictatorship. Whether
my first thing on with talking about this to Marxists is like, while I'm not a populist in any stretch of the imagination, I do, and I'll tell you why a bit later, but I do think that the idea of an insurrection and then just imposing your will through an insurrection, and that being the means of which you have proletarian whatever, an established proletarian tire, has three problems, and I'll just state them right out. One, you recreate a lot of the functions that you abolish to maintain the productive forces, and you don't, because you're under stress, both internally and externally, you will justify this, but that gets into a cul-de-sac that you can't get out of.
And they're worse than they were before. You're
right.
The militarization of labor in the Soviet Union was worse than it was under capitalism before, almost. Yeah, in some way.
Two, you have to, the only way to keep a lot of these groups on board with the revolution is that you can't. So you have to the natural instincts is to try to terrorize them. Yeah. Three, the problem with that, not just from like the humanistic problem of like murdering thousands of people, but the other problem with that is that it exhausts society in general. Like that level of violence for that long exhausts society and creates people who just want stability and wants it through any means necessary because they're tired of the violence. Yeah. And what you find interesting about Lenin's writings are all over the place, but if you want like a kind of rough draft for the Yezhovchina, and the one thing I'll say about the Yezhovchina, which is the purges, is that it's not just Stalin, because the one thing that you see open up during this time period is all these social conflicts that have been buried that aren't about class. Well, now we have a means to get revenge. Yeah. And that opens up, and then you have like Stalin going like, well, we need a quota of, I mean, literally he had quotas of like, find this many counter-revolutionaries. And so people start settling other kinds of social and ethnic and whatever grudges.
Every time there's an opportunity for it, and you even see it today with some cancel culture stuff. They're like, oh, I can use this as an excuse to get my ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend, or
right.
And if you read, I think it's Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman's boyfriend. They both write accounts of their time in the early Russian Revolution, and Berkman is pointing out they're having these trials at the time, and he witnessed literal trials where he saw afterwards the main witness for the prosecution was saying, oh yeah, he was my ex, he cheated on me, that's why I said all this stuff. Like that stuff is there as soon as you have the chance to do it. As soon as you have kangaroo courts, that's what you get in them. Yeah.
Right. So, and of course then anti-communists will seize on this to point out, well, one, you're not really abolishing class, so you just lied about equity in the first place.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was necessarily Lenin's point. I mean, you and I both, my reading of Lenin is like very complicated, but I do think you have to, one of the things that get very frustrated people when they talk about Lenin though, is you just talk about what he wrote, but you don't talk about what he did.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Like, one of the things that I've noticed that a lot of communists do not want to talk about, it's not the purges. They'll talk about that. Although you have these Marxist Leninists like, they didn't do it, but if they did do it, they did it. It was right. Like, it's like, be like, if you read like people who cite Grover Furr.
Yeah. That's everybody now. It's like, God, I can't tell you how many people I know are just sucked into this stuff. Like,
well, I mean, Grover Furr's arguments are all arguments. Every one of them is an argument from ignorance. Like, we can't 100% prove that this happened. The enemies of communists like it. Therefore, we're just going to assume, even though we can't prove the opposite, that it's false. And
therefore, It was
therefore trust the propaganda released by the Soviet Union, except when it's inconvenient. And then when it's inconvenient, such as later propaganda, later revealings, later archive work revealed by the Soviet Union itself, we're not going to accept it then because they were bad historical nihilists.
Just the idea that, oh fuck, what's the guy's name? Trotsky, the three, oh god, Trotsky, Stalin,
Bukharin.
Bukharin, yeah. Just the idea that Bukharin was like some kind of fascist sympathizer, like that's the most insane thing that you could ever imagine. If you know the history of Bukharin, whatever you think about him, he always went with the party line, no matter what. Like, he was the party guy first. He might have completely disagreed with the position, but then he really believed in following the party line. So the idea that somehow this guy is a secret fascist, whatever, he participated in every good and bad thing that the party ever did. Like, it's absolutely insane. You can't, that's just enough, just knowing that, and then seeing Grover Furr justify, oh yeah, he was totally guilty. Yeah, it's bonkers. You can't,
Yeah, I mean, there's been other things where I've caught Grover Furr just misattributing things. For example, he attributes to Trotsky something said by the Italian communist Bordiga, where Bordiga in the Comintern, who's the last man to stand up to Stalin directly and walk away from him. And so, while I don't love Bordiga's theory, that's impressive. But because Bordiga calls Stalin the grave digger of the revolution, it wasn't Trotsky.
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't know.
Yeah. And he calls him that to his face. In a Comintern meeting, and then walks out, and then they marginalize him.
You interviewed a Bordiga guy like a million years ago. I think I heard that episode, and the guy was like,
yeah. There's a couple of Bordigas in my circle. The problem that you have with Bordigas is their answer is like it's actually probably even more authoritarian than Stalin.
Yeah, so, the workers more than it's like what is this theology? This is not left communism.
They're like,
I don't know what this is. Yeah.
Early Bordiga's really advocating that all the countries need to be equal in the Comintern, and that's actually something I totally agree with.
Yeah.
But later Bordiga's like talking about how like any democracy at all is a concession to like bourgeois tropes, and we need organic centralism, which is run not even by like a political dictator like Stalin. It's run by like engineers. Like, we basically need to put the party's engineers in absolute control.
It's like 2 steps away from Curtis Yarvin. What's the
so which it's interesting because it leads to this weird development where you have because and Bordiga considered himself like a Leninist who was more Leninist than Lenin. Like, this is like his theory was like, well, I'm just doing what Lenin does, but he wasn't consistent. I'm going to be consistent about it.
He didn't have the balls to go all the way. Yeah.
Right. And
true.
And so what, like,
I mean, Lenin in the last years of his life basically not recanted, but regretted the results of everything he did. Like, he's like, oh shit, we need more democracy in the party somehow. How did that happen? Uh-oh.
Yeah, but it goes to show that like he doesn't undo the faction ban in 1921. If people want to know why socialists split all the time, that's why. Because with the faction ban, if you have a disagreement, you have to leave.
Yep.
And he justified the faction ban as a condition of the Civil War, and also like to suppress the SRs.
But then when the Civil War, that's the whole thing with all the Lenin stuff. Even if you look at what they said and not what they did, there's clues in there that there's something wrong. Because when if you talk to a lot of Leninists today, they had to do militarization of labor because of the Civil War and all the chaos. Yeah, but there's nothing, when Lenin and Trotsky start advocating for all that stuff, they never say, oh, well, obviously socialism is worker control of industry, and this is just some temporary emergency measure that we have to do because industry is in such a state of collapse. I'm sorry, workers, but don't worry, you're going to be in the driver's seat soon when this stuff is all settled. They don't say any of that. They're just like, workers love discipline. They love to get whipped in the ass. They love to be told what to do and to be punished if they look the wrong way. So yeah, it's basically, as Marx would have predicted, once you become the boss, you start to think like the boss. Like, I've seen it happen. Like, people who are tenants their whole lives and hate landlords all of a sudden inherit money, buy a property, and become vicious, psychotic landlords hating tenants. It's like, that's what happens.
This is why Marx is actually right to stress that class, not class origins. Like, he doesn't focus on your class origin at all.
Yeah.
Like, Marx is always like, your class is what you do,
is what you are right now.
And there's a shift in communism, and this is even more pronounced in China, where like class origins become the predominant thing. So were you born a worker or were you born into the bourgeoisie? It matters not at all what you do now. In fact,
the racialization of class.
Yeah. And in fact, this is criticized in the 50s during the Thousand Flowers period. And then of course Mao purges all those people in the anti-rightist campaigns later, because it's like, well, I don't like the fact that you pointed out that we have a caste system.
Yeah.
And so this is, I keep on pointing out, and one of the things that I think you're right about, basically by the 1950s, just to tie this all together, you've had this situation in the Soviet Union. There's no attempt to pull out to the rest. The popular fronts have all helped the liberal governments and the capitalist governments. They haven't really helped the socialist ones. And so you see this switch to anti-imperialism, which is a good, but it becomes the primary focus.
Mm-hmm.
And developmentalism, which I think is interesting, because a lot of people cite Bukharin for this. Bukharin's the person who comes up with socialism in one country, which is a fatal mistake. And you're right. I think one thing we can critique Bukharin for is Bukharin believed in party discipline, even when he thought the party was wrong.
Yeah.
But Bukharin's reason for the NEP and for allowing for some market elements was not because he thought that there needed to be some kind of market socialism. He actually was explicitly kind of against that. He was originally on the left faction, to the left of Trotsky, even though he gets associated with right opposition later.
Yeah.
He thought that you had to keep the peasants involved without killing them, because it would lead to a social collapse and all this social chaos. And well, after Bukharin is gone and after Kirov is murdered, what happens? Like, it's exactly what he said. You end up having do these dekulagization campaigns. You end up doing stuff like the Khanty massacre.
But that's Stalin instigating all that stuff. I remember Lenin's original theory, and I think that this is when he went back to sort of in the NEP, was, well, we have this before he sort of adopted Trotsky's theory, his theory for a few years was, well, we have this totally peasant country, but they're ready to revolt, but there's too petit bourgeois. So what we need to do is we need to take over the country as a junior coalition partner. It's going to be a government of the peasantry and proletariat, revolutionary dictatorship of the peasantry and proletariat. We're going to be the junior coalition partner in the government. And basically over the course of he called it the American model. Over the course of 50 years, you're going to have peasant petit bourgeois capitalism develop on its own and create a class system where the market's going to do its thing, and you're going to have a smaller number of richer and richer people, and then a big mass of proletarian agricultural workers. And once that proletarian layer gets big enough, then we'll have our natural constituency for a proletarian revolution, and then we'll have the revolution. And I think they kind of went back to that in the NEP, which is one of the shitty things, is that Lenin was basing his whole idea on that the commune was finished, the commune was being wiped out, and there was no potential for that peasant communism. And what he didn't realize is that the commune prevented that class structure from developing there was markets, but the market didn't have the same effect that it would have on an individualized system, because it had a communized system. So there were mechanisms within the commune to prevent wealth inequality from getting worse. It could only last one generation at a time. Basically, it would get redistributed in this weird way by redividing up the lands. So anyways, I think, that was his basic idea, but it was wrong. It was based on incorrect understanding of how the market works in the communist environment, in the communized peasant environment. And if I correct it, the NEP was based on, let's just do that. Let's let that happen. We're going to keep the peasants under control of the party, and we're going to police them. But then it's a bit like what China's doing, except on this mass industrial scale. But Russia was doing that on the sort of peasant scale.
Yeah, I mean, Deng's citation for what he does is actually Bukharin, and early and very late Stalin. So it's like Stalin from the end of the NEP as he was managing it with Bukharin to Stalin in 1951 when he writes Economic Problems of the Soviet Union. But he skips, and also so do most Marxist-Leninists now, the 1932 through 19.
Yep, Stalin undid
45.
The peasant commune managed to last through everything, and then Stalin killed it. It's amazing. He killed the communism that existed in the Soviet Union,
which then leads to the Gulag revolts, which were real. But the thing is, they happened because of what he did.
The NEP. The thing about the NEP is that it allowed all this class of middlemen who are these hated. It's complicated with the kulaks because the kulaks kind of barely existed in pre-revolutionary Russia, but they existed more in post-revolutionary Russia because the party, the way that they structured things, allowed that sort of middleman to get really rich, whereas the system before didn't. There was a tiny number of people. Like the Stalin's whole idea is that there's this class of peasants who are just getting rich on the backs of everyone else, and that wasn't really true. It was these small middlemen that weren't really peasants, but the NEP really made that much worse, basically. And that was sort of the plan. They wanted to create that class antagonism within the peasantry. They didn't want they were afraid of the peasantry becoming a united front against the Bolsheviks, basically.
Right. I think, and they had reasons to think they would, because traditionally, while the peasantry was pretty revolutionary, it was aligned with the SRs and the Narodniki.
Totally. I mean, that's what they were logically afraid of, which was probably true. That the peasants would eventually get sick of them and say, "We don't need these motherfuckers." Yeah.
And then what I think is interesting in the Deng case is that's on steroids in Deng's reform. So they do cite it as the goal and why they pivot from which are worker peasant co-op communes where really were like there were barely any markets. There was labor tokens given. You could exchange hours for like skilled work, but you all had to do some.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
But the thing in pre-revolutionary Russia, you had the cooperative, which was the nexus point between the country and the city. So honestly, I don't know the details of how it worked, but there was some kind of system where they would exchange goods in some kind of cooperative manner between the city and between the country. But when they did the NEP, they had suppressed those cooperatives as a locus of potential opposition to the Bolsheviks. And then what happened is you just had these middlemen just profiteering off of everything. So they became this like hated and rejected class that was actually a hated symbol of the Bolsheviks, ironically, this little capitalist middleman class.
Right. And so there's a lot of anger directed at them, but that becomes a justification for the peasant suppressions in the 1930s.
Exactly. Beautiful. Yeah.
Right. And I think what's interesting about that is, like, when I say this is on steroids in the Deng period, I mean, I still point out to people when they're like, well, China controls its capitalist. I'm like, yes, but also it has more billionaires than the United States. I realize that it doesn't per capita, but it's hard for me to justify any country having a large number of billionaires, particularly if that country is ostensibly communist.
Yeah.
Like,
well, I mean, their justification, right? They're like, well, we couldn't become a real socialist state because we were too agricultural. Marx was right. We need to mass industrialize, but we're going to do what Lenin and Trotsky said is we're going to mass industrialize, or Stalin basically, we're just going to mass industrialize under the guiding wisdom of the party to make sure that the proletariat is always in control and it never gets out of hand. And even now they have socialism by 2050. You know how in the Soviet Union they're like, well, we're going to reach socialism by 1980, or we're going to reach socialism. They're always pushing it ahead 20 years. Well, they do the same thing in Russia. Now, socialism is supposed to happen in 2050 or 2030. No, it must be 2050. And then we're going to move from there on to and eventually they're supposed to expropriate all the billionaires and expropriate all that stuff, and it's going to be real communism one day. They don't emphasize it too much, but that's still the official.
Right.
Yeah.
this is the other thing that I always point out when people, when they're like, oh, we have to defend socialist China because it's socialist. And I'm like, they don't even say that.
Yeah.
Like,
they're not even, exactly. We're not there. They're not there yet. There's just, we're preparing the ground. So they're basically, we're having managed capitalism so that we can have socialism in the future as per Marx, 1867 or whatever.
And that is Lenin's theory in the 20s, which is we have to do state capitalism to undo the fact that we didn't join up with the West and we didn't go through a capitalist period. So now we have to do it ourselves.
We have to do it ourselves, and that's what communism is all over the world. Like, that's why only poor countries go communist, because it's just an alternative way of industrializing without being under Western exploitation imperialism.
I mean, and frankly, if your options are the Soviet development regime or the one offered to you by the World Bank, I'd also choose the Soviet one.
Well, that's why you can't shit on Cuba and Vietnam the way you can shit on the USSR, and China. Like, you're like, yeah, well, they escaped imperialism, and the suffering that they're going through is more of a result of the imperialist attacks on them and their, economically sanctioned off from the world than anything else. That probably, I'd rather be somebody in Cuba than in somebody in the Dominican Republic or whatever, right?
Absolutely. Like, and I guess, but one of the things that I've seen recently, with the exception of like, we don't, like when Marxist-Leninists, they don't do this with like Norway, which I find funny because I'm like, oh, so you're not going to mention the social democratic countries in Europe, even though, and they're kind of right to in some ways, because we've, like, those have been neoliberalized too.
They're still, like, they started from such a stronger point that they've been neoliberal for 20 years, but they're still like
50 way better than the US
than Canada ever was or the US ever was. So their degraded neoliberal state is like paradise, is like Star Trek paradise compared to even Canada in its heyday in the 80s, right?
Well, this is one of the things that I point out to people when I'm talking about this. I'm like, look, I talk to people from Sweden and Norway all the time, and they tell me how bad it is now. And
you had a really good episode with this guy talking about social democracy in Sweden.
Yeah. But at the same time, when I tell them what it's like in America, they're shocked.
Yeah. It's like, you don't understand. Like, dude, I remember I had this friend in when I was in university. His Norway was paying him not just his tuition to go to school, but they're paying his living expenses, his travel. Like, I don't know, they were giving like $30,000 a year to go study in Montreal. Like, it was like,
Oh, it wasn't. It was. They were even paying for it out of country. That's crazy.
Yeah, he's going to study, and he was probably paying triple the tuition I was, right? Because he's from out of town, and so the Norwegian government was paying for everything, which makes sense. Like, when you're giving a student money, like, I have friends who are like, "Oh yeah, I got a scholarship to go to this school for $60,000, and I can't even go because I can't afford to live," like.
Yeah. So, I guess we've kind of been in this cul-de-sac of what happened, but I think what you're right about is there's this shift where both sides kind of agree liberty and equality are separated during the Cold War. Like, you can have one or you can have the other, but you can't have both, and we're both going to argue that.
Yeah, that's it. Like, so what I talked about a few times in my show. Yeah, in class, from the French Revolution, from before the French Revolution until basically the Russian Revolution, the idea of liberty and equality, it's so against our nature. Like, we're so indoctrinated the opposite way, but liberty and equality have to go together. If you don't have equality, both political equality, but also economic equality, you're just going to be dominated by the people who have more money than you and more power than you, and they're going to tell you what to do all day. And that's not equality. That's serfdom. That's servitude, whatever you call it. It's the whole thing. Adam Smith understood that contracts and markets are great between equal parties, but as soon as the parties aren't equal, it's not a contract. It's an excuse for servitude. You're just codifying the power imbalance and making sure that it stays that way for as long as the contract lasts. You're disadvantaging the person who has less bargaining power is giving away all their obligations and getting very little benefits, and the person with all the bargaining power is getting all the benefits and giving away very little obligations. That's what contracts are. So yeah, liberty and equality were the same thing. They were fundamental to each other. All of a sudden, after the Cold War, Russia is like, okay, we don't want to talk about liberty anymore because that makes us look really bad because we have no more liberty. But we're going to talk about equality, but equality is material equality, equality between nations, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and relative material equality. So, the Soviet Union in the 80s still had the Gini coefficient was like similar to Scandinavia at its peak,
Right.
And that's what they focused on. And hey, if you're in the third world, that's a great, I'll take that, right? Over alternatives, right? But and the US is like, yeah, that's the choice. You either have liberty with no equality, and that's just freedom. Freedom is at the price of equality, or you have equality, meaning equality of economics. They don't even think about political equality anymore. That doesn't exist. And so you'll have security, but that security comes at the cost of your liberty, and that's the choice you have. And Soviet Union and the U.S. both agreed, yeah, that's the choice you have. It's, but our choice is better. It's better to have security, and the U.S. is no, it's better to have freedom. And it's just this, oh well, what can you do? The life sucks no matter what you do. Better to be under my thumb or my thumb.
Yeah. I mean, what is funny about this, and when I say funny, kind of sad, I do think they're in both, because people are going to really know my Soviet sympathies when I say who I actually like in the Soviet Union, but it's Khrushchev and Khrushchev the most, and then I don't hate Gorby, actually.
Oh yeah, Gorbachev, Khrushchev less, but Gorbachev, yeah, he was trying his best. I don't know,
Well, my thing about
a little bit naive, and I don't think he understood exactly how fucked up the country was, so he made mistakes, but he was trying to do the right thing.
Well, Gorby's Khrushchev's interesting because while I do think the secret speech is partly to absolve himself,
all the bad things that Stalin did, it was all Stalin. It was all Stalin.
Yeah, it wasn't the rest of us at all, except for Beria, who were gonna. And Beria, to be fair, I mean, we talk about Yuzhov being a monster. Marxist-Leninists will admit that Yuzhov was a monster. Yeah. Beria was worse.
Beria was worse than Stalin. He was just like a fucking demon. It's like you can barely get a guy like that bad.
What's also funny is his plans, as far as like for Stalin, were just as much market liberalization as you saw in the Khrushchev. So like
that's it. He saw himself that after Stalin that he would be the hero of anti-Stalinism. That was his plan. After he was finished being a pedophile and raping all he thought he would be the hero of anti-Stalinism afterwards. Yeah.
Basically Khrushchev beat him at his game, but Khrushchev really was interested in like actually, this is very similar to the time period I'm talking about in China, where in the Cultural Revolution, you have a lot of real interesting innovations and attempt for things. You don't have that so much in Khrushchev's Russia, but Khrushchev really is trying to like stabilize food production, not suppress people as badly. But what he starts getting into is he leans into Russian chauvinism a little bit more consistently than Stalin, because Stalin was all over the place on when he was like pro minority groups and when he was pro greater Russian chauvinism. It varies, and it's not consistent in time period either. Like
whatever works at this moment to get the job done.
Yeah, basically. There was a biographer of Stalin, not Kakin, a new one, who basically said, look, I mean, he believed what he said. He actually was a devoted Bolshevik. It wasn't cynical. And he had the personality of a corporate CEO sociopath. And and I think that's actually pretty accurate from what I can tell from reading him. I'm like, no, I don't think he was ever like, if Stalin fooled anyone, it was himself. But yeah, so
that was in the two when they opened the archives. It was in the 90s and the 2009 or something. Yeah, the researchers, especially the anti-communist researchers, were shocked. Like, oh my god, the Politburo is 100% sincere, and all they're thinking about is how do we make socialism? How do we make socialism? They're not just a cynical ruling elite. They're seriously thinking about how you make socialism, which is how ruling elites all do. The best ruling elites, the most cynical Catholic popes and emperors, they're seriously believing that they're the most religious person in the world. Religion is just a reflection of your class. Your ideology is just a reflection of your class position. It's just a bunch of justifications for it in many ways, not just, but yeah.
So, I think that's that gets us into, this period post 1992, because
Mm.
you have this what I like to call the Great Confusion, where you can, like, there's some socialist regimes still around, but two of them don't look socialist anymore. One of them is struggling, but kind of maintaining, on an island in the Atlantic, and then there's a DPRK, which even Honecker, the head of the GDR, the DDR, depending on whether or not you say it in German or in English, who was like, I don't know why we consider those guys communists. That was Honecker, like the head of the East German government, was like, I don't understand why we consider the North Koreans communists.
I mean, even North Korea has, I think, dropped the pretense. They stopped. They don't talk. They're talking way more about Juche or whatever than they are about socialism and Marx and anything like that anymore.
They in the end of the Kim Jong-il period, they dropped a lot of the references to Marxism and the Constitution. And Juche is interesting because its focus is on autarky, like we're completely self-reliant, and then the coalition of three classes, which is the bourgeois, not the bourgeois. The bourgeois is not part of that coalition.
The intellectual, the peasant. And,
it's the intellectual, the peasants, and they
have a pen. Their thing is a hammer, a sickle, and a pen. That's their symbol. Yeah.
But what is interesting about that, if by saying the intellectia in there, and you also realize that they're the intelligentsia. People correct me on that all the time. that you see that on the flag, right? That you have to remind yourself that the intelligentsia in Confucian societies were a ruling class. They were not. They were not just a class. I mean, they're not even like the professional workers now. They were basically
the explicit ruling elite. Like, this is
they're not the so to put it in like
we are the rightful elite because we have the Confucian education and we've gone through the ranks and passed the tests.
Right. They're meritocratic lords as opposed to blood lords. Like, but they are that. Like, they're basically scholar lords, scholar gentry. And when you have that on your flag, you're basically admitting that, like, well, we got rid of the king and we got rid of the imperialists, but like we're incorporating the ruling aristocracy into our class structure.
And the pen is in the middle of both the other ones, right? Yeah.
Right.
It's not it's there for a reason. Yeah.
So it's one of these things where I'm like, plus, they're the only communist society that has high birth heredity leadership. That's
the hereditary. Yeah, no, it's such a joke.
It's like
there's no question. If they don't even bother let's have a fake election to see if the next guy he just won because he was the best. It's like, nope, he's just the leader now because leaders beget great leaders.
Right. And so like when I've been reading some more recent Marxist-Leninist agitprop, and they basically equate Cuba and the DPRK and Bolivia and Venezuela as all the same kind of society. And I'm like, that's nuts.
Yeah, I heard people say, oh, well, Bolivia is a dictatorship of the proletariat, but Venezuela is this. I was like, what are you talking about? What? Yeah.
Right. It's just wild, the contortions that you have to do to.
It's communist, and it's just like, what are you? It's
worth
engaging with. You're just destroying your own mind. Like, have you ever been to? At one point, I had a friend who was like serious drug addict, and we went to those. What's the meetings for people who are like related to the No, the Al-Anon. You're not an alcoholic, but your friends are. So you're going to. How do I deal with the
Narcotics Anonymous?
No,
the other one.
I think it's called Al-Anon. Anyways, there's one.
The Ally one.
Yeah, Al-Anon is. Yeah, but they're basically telling you, don't try to get in the head of the person to communicate with them. Like, they're just crazy, and you're going to become crazy if you try to understand what they're thinking. just tell them how it is. Like whatever, like one of the things is just never get in the head of the suicidal person. Don't get in the head of the alcoholic person because you can't, because it's craziness and you're just going to become crazy thinking about it. And that's what I often think once I start going down these rabbit holes, reading with a Marxist Leninists or anyone is thinking like, okay, forget it, I'm done. I can't. My brain's going to explode if I try to, understand this. But they understand it. Yeah.
Well, what I find interesting is how the categories don't mean anything. Like one of the things I've seen recently is the shift to multipolarity talk, which I don't find like multipolarism as expressed in imperial British geopolitics is where it comes from. By the way, it doesn't come from anywhere near. Yes, that's its initial origin. It's 19th and early 20th century geopolitical strategy in the British Empire. It gets revived, interestingly and kind of Marxistly, by world system theorists who talk about the need for, ironically, for the developing world to decouple from the developed world to develop its own independence, which again sounds a lot like this Vera Zulik letter, right? But that's where it kind of comes back into Marxist discourse. They look at like, well, there's this imperialist discourse. Let's look at that. My point about it is like multipolarity says nothing, absolutely nothing at all about power relationships beyond who's the dominant hegemon. And by that I say the dominant hegemon, because one of the things that multipolarity is not claiming, for example, that they're going to stop the U.S.'s Monroe Doctrine or destroy U.S. regional hegemony, because if they claim that, that's going to immediately lead to nuclear war, and they know it. So that's where multipolarity comes from. Now, fine, as a descriptor of the way states interact, that's true, and there may be some more space for various proletariats to work in that if there's multiple people to play off of. But one of the things that you see what people do when they do this is they start equating proletariat to the nation in which they're in, as if that nation is the representative of whatever class, which is never true. And there's only two groups of people who ever claimed it. And I'm not saying to say that they're the same, but it is that these are where they come from in Marxist theory. The Italian Marxist syndicalists who become the left wing of fascism, and then Mussolini picks up this rhetoric. They pick up proletarian nation, and concurrently and separately, it's not related. Pre-Maoist leaders of the faction of the Communist Party that encouraged them to align with the Kuomintang, which also Stalin encouraged them to do. They start talking about the need for national development, and they start talking about China as a proletarian nation.
But you see, but just that same conflation of categories, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about stop talking about race and start talking about class. It's that same idea, because you're just conflating. That's the way that an elite disguises itself within a greater polity in order to hide its antagonism to the same classes below it inside that polity. And that Lenin was really, you'd see that a lot with the Bolsheviks. Before even the revolution, he would always talk about the proletariat will do this, the proletariat will do that, but he's literally talking about the Bolshevik party. And in his mind and in the minds of all the leadership of the Bolsheviks, they are the proletariat, even though half of them weren't proletarians in any way, shape, or form. They just saw themselves, well, we're the proletarian party, so we are the proletariat. And that's that confusion that you see in every elite who's trying to piggyback on somebody else.
Well, this goes back to there's a rhetorical strategy that I've always been fascinated with that goes back into Hegel. Actually, it's the class in itself and the class for itself. So the class in itself is a sociological reality of the class. The class for itself is what the class does when it is conscious of a situation and acts in unison. However, there's a lot of Marxists who talk about we don't need to discuss the class in itself at all.
Oh, right.
The class for itself is the only thing we're interested in, and we can speak to that because of the objective scientific truth of Marxism or Marxist-Leninism or whatever.
The intellectual becomes part of the proletariat just by wanting to ally with it, basically.
Right, which is, I mean, Marx does talk about that. Like there are debates between Marx and Blanqui about like, well, if intellectuals see themselves as part of their future in the proletariat, they can join them. But what's really interesting is like Ingalls makes it very clear that like they can't lead them. Like they can give them skills, they can help, but they cannot lead.
It's funny that those, that's Marx and Engels saying that, and you don't see that in any of their followers. They just don't believe it because it makes no sense in the modern context, because there's no labor movement, there's no big labor movement, there's no socialist labor movement, there's no socialist movement. So the idea that like you have to, and that's the whole lesson of the Russian Revolution, you have to, as an intellectual class, you have all, and Trotsky really pointed this out, as the intellectual class, you have all these advantages. You are, in a sense, have that natural tendency to lead the ideology of everything, to map out the different alternatives and possibilities. But if you are leading this is destined, bound, this train is bound for hell. Like there's no way that you can lead this. You have to be jumping on the bandwagon of the movement, of the actual people, the actual majority of the population, and then helping them accomplish the goals that they want to accomplish. And telling them, well, I don't like this, I think it should be like this, but you can't be in charge everything, because then you are just creating your own dictatorship, because that's how humans operate. Yeah.
Well, that does lead to the like fundamental paradox, and this was pointed out by the right winger James Burnham when he was becoming a right winger and wasn't totally one yet. That like the leadership of the revolutionary movements have never come from the same class that what they're claiming to represent, and he eventually uses that insight to pick up Italian elite theory. So like basically Rebel Michel and all these people who either were liberals that moved towards proto-fascist and fascist positions, are former socialists who moved towards proto-fascist positions. It's like, well,
natural progression of that stuff,
right? where they're like, okay, well, we can't really get rid of classes, so maybe we can run it for the betterment of the people in a corporate situation. And corporate means all the classes just get along. Yeah. And how do we do that? Well, then we do what Marx criticized in France, which is like you start relying on a Bonapartist figure to get all these classes in line, because it's an authoritarian figure. It can hold everything together.
Yep.
And the critique of that is, well, yeah, but then usually the system falls apart. Like you have political chaos after Bonaparte in France for 100 years. Like it's,
or the critique is just that's not what you want. Like the class system sucks to begin with. And if you're a socialist, right? The whole point of socialism is, if the majority is not leading this, then it's not socialism, then it's something else. Right.
Like, but even if you give up on socialism, my point is like these people were socialists. They give up. They think there's no way for us to do this because of this iron law oligarchy. If we just have like a Bonapartist figure, we can kind of control them. And this is where my critique of populism comes in.
It doesn't work on its own terms, right?
Right. It doesn't work on its own terms. This is where my critique of populism comes in.
Okay, yeah.
Most populists end up being not actual populists, but what they end up doing is promoting a counter elite that speaks for the people, but does not necessarily have their interest. But that
makes it a fake populism, though, at the end of the day, right?
Well, I don't know. What is fake and what is real? I think to make it about fakeness makes it about intention. Michael Lind.
You just have to define what it means. To say like socialism is worker control of industry. Well, then you can judge what's going on. This is a fake socialist because they're not actually promoting, worker control of industry.
But what is populism?
What is populism? I don't know. Yeah, you have to define it, and then you can judge whether it's fake or not. Yeah.
But because what is populism that isn't corporatism in the old European sense, which is like the classes are getting along and you're doing stuff for the people, which does not necessarily mean abolishing hierarchy. It just means getting people what they want. However, that's not the reason why socialism. You think socialism is a mess. Populism has egalitarian populist tendencies and then Bonapartist populist tendencies, and that's not new. Like it's not like there's just right and left wing populism. It's not just like a post-Trump thing. That's been around for as long as socialism's been around, honestly.
But isn't that a way of harnessing populist energies towards right-wing ends, because that's what we see that now, and that's what Bonaparte was doing. So you're basically, I don't know, a lot of this stuff is grabbing conservative personality tendencies and liberal ones and using them for the same ends in a way. I don't know.
Well, this is something that we talked about with Arnold, that like we have to admit that one of the confusions of our current ideology is confusing temperament with ideological content.
Exactly. It's huge. And that's what I really want to focus on is liberal and I think we talked about it before, but liberal and conservative are dispositions. And it's really interesting in our evolutionary past where I think this comes from, like Evo doing evolutionary psychology. In the Paleolithic, when we were evolving into humans, the climate was shifting radically every couple of generations to every few generations. So it could be every 40 years, every 200 years, you're having radical shifts. So during the period where the climate is stable, conservatism makes sense because we want to keep following the life ways of our ancestors because it works. But you always, and it's a bell curve distribution of conservative versus liberal tendencies. And what they track with is openness and closeness to new experience. So if you're, and it's a bell curve distribution, so most people are in the middle, and then you have these small wings who are on the radical opposite ends. And what I think that does is, in times when things are stable, people will tend to keep things as they are. But when the climate has changed, when the old way of life isn't good anymore, you always have that radical group of people who go like, no, we want to do something different. We've got to do something different. Like those crazy Polynesian sailors who went out like and spread out all across Polynesia. Like, what kind of crazy maniac does that? Well, that's crazy in normal, stable times, but in other times, that's the right thing to do, and that's how humans survive. So we have this bell curve distribution of openness versus closeness to experience. And in the past, like 100 years ago, in the populist movement or in the socialist movement, you had conservative disposition socialists and communists and liberal disposition socialists and communists. But what I think has happened is because of the PR industry and the advertising industry in politics, the parties have sort of morphed into message, like how do we message to liberal-minded people and conservative-minded people, and they found the sort of messages that resonate both with them. And so the Republican Party, and that's why you have this crazy, like what every election in the US is like fucking 50-50-50-50. It's ridiculous. And I think it's because you just have this messaging of, here's how we message to the people with conservative dispositions, here's how we message to the people with liberal dispositions, and the liberals are the Democrats and the conservatives are the Republicans. But it doesn't have to be that way, and there's sort of policies attached to that. But it doesn't need to be that way. You can have and you see this with this weird, compact, like these weird, like, that there's that guy. So what's his name? He just came out.
Robin Murray. I actually interviewed him. So.
Oh, you interviewed him. Okay, I got to check that out. Yeah, his new book. It's like, I'm hearing him talking about his new book, which I think is not out yet, but I really want to read it. I'm like, this guy's like almost a socialist. He's almost talking communism here. Like, he hasn't abandoned the market, but he's just a conservative disposition person who is coming to the conclusion that quasi-socialism is the way to go. So this is where, and there's a huge sentiment, there's a huge chunk of people, like, again, 50% of the population tends towards conservatism, 50% tends towards liberalism, but that's not a political content, that is personality disposition, openness versus closeness to experience. But I'd say a majority of people have left-wing ideas of how, what kind of policies they want. And you see it in Canada. 60% of conservative voters would raise their own taxes to better fund the healthcare system. Why are you voting conservative? Because the messaging system has fried your brains, right? Like that's what's going on, because you hate the liberals and you're afraid of the cancel culture is going to get you fired for questioning some this or that like stupid thing. Like what that woman who was on the Star Wars who got that drives me nuts. Like that woman, the woman Gina Carano who got fired from the Mandalorian. Do you watch Star Wars? Those things?
Yeah.
So, you know what she got fired for? And I'm Jewish, so fuck you, I can say this. She said, oh, well, the way that she tweeted some dumb anti-mask stuff and anti-vax stuff and whatever, I don't care about that. And then she hated the backlash. So she said, oh, well, being a Republican today is like being a Jew in Nazi Germany. And before they executed all the Jews, they demonized them so that when they executed them, nobody cared or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, that's dumbass. But it's not anti-Semitism. It's just dumbass. And she got fucking fired for saying something that my own Jewish relatives who live in Florida and Texas and are they're immigrants from Morocco, and they become Republicans over time because whatever, it fried their brains because they're whatever reasons we won't get into. But they think like that. That's something that would make sense to them. And you're firing her for anti-Semitism. Like, fuck you. You're telling half the country that if you think out loud, you're not allowed to debate. You're not allowed to discuss. You can't change your mind unless you're allowed to say the wrong thing so that someone can correct you. You can't learn anything better. You're going to get fired. So these people are terrified of the liberals and the left and all this stuff. And then they go hardcore for Trump. It happens. I see it in universities too. Some of my friends who are teachers are like, yeah, you have these 2-3 students in every class who interrupt every lecture to say that this is racist, this is sexist, this is racist, this is sexist, and accusing all the teacher of being racist and the students of being racist. And what you have is 95% of the students being like, oh my God, I hate these people. If they ever get any power, I'm going to get fired at my job. And then they become secret Republicans. It's awful. Or Pierre Poilievre supporters or whatever.
Yeah, this is interesting because you see this in the current debates around like which party is the party of the poor. I got in trouble with Carl Bajer about this because I told him he claimed that the Democrats were the party of the working class, and I'm like, they are the party of the minority of the urban poor alone that vote. But
the majority of poor people don't vote. That's the thing.
Exactly.
Class because they don't fucking vote.
And then they're like, well, the majority of people who make over $100,000 a year vote Republican. And I'm like, yes, but what you're not pointing out is the majority of people who make over $250,000 a year vote Democrat.
Yeah.
And
the Democrats actually surpassed now the Republicans on average income, which is horrifying.
Right. Which just tells you that like most of this doesn't seem to have that much meaning.
No. Well, it's just what I think it's my theory is just that messaging. They figured out how to message to the conservative-minded person, or it's not that clean. It's also the person who's raised in the area has these kind of cultural signifiers and whatever, versus the liberal-minded person, and we've just divided on this weird evolutionary line, which is just divide and conquer politics. You have two right wings. You have the liberal right wing who uses racial politics in the guise of anti-racism, but it's actually pretty racist, and it appeals to those instincts. And then you have the conservative politics, which use racial politics in the straight up racist way. That's very clear and obvious. It's like a bit in Israel. You talk to Palestinians and oftentimes they're like, yeah, well, we'd rather have Netanyahu than whatever the liberal guy is at the time, because the liberals are such complete hypocrites. They're talking about equality. They talk about Palestinian rights, but they're just doing the same fucking bloody thing. I'd rather have the straight up racist guy in power so the whole world can see how evil they are versus this fucking pseudo, stuff. And I think a lot of that, the quote unquote anti-racism, because it's not anti-racist, it's racist. That like white supremacy memo. Have you seen that?
Mm-hmm.
That's racist against black people. Well, the white fragility stuff is racist against black people. Like you're training people to become racist against black people with white fragility trainings. You're training even a well-intentioned person who wants to be anti-racist. You're becoming so scared of a black person walks in the room with you, and you're so scared of being evil or doing the wrong thing that your cortisol shoots up, and it's like you're doggy training someone to have a bad emotional response to the presence of brown people. That's racism. That's what that fucking training is doing, making you racist.
Well, I guess that
nightmare.
I guess we've been kind of all over the place today. One thing that I'd like to
we need to talk. Yeah,
maybe. Yeah, to pivot towards is your focus on the fact that people have that there's been this movement amongst liberal elites to claim that one, that talking about class politics is actually a backdoor way to do race politics. It's pro-white, which is absurd.
In that affirmative action decision, Sotomayor was basically arguing against class-based admissions to universities because she was saying, well, class is just a proxy for race, so why don't we just talk about the real thing? Like, that's how fried everybody's minds are in that, from that milieu.
Right. I mean, I remember reading that. I actually read that between Sotomayor and Clarence Thomas, and I was like, oh my God.
It's like, this is a joke.
It's like if this is the battle of elites we are totally fucked. Like, Because
that's intersectionality taken the wrong. It's weird. The intersectionality is always taken the wrong way. Like they talk about class, but it's just a slogan. It's not real. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, class is a proxy for it's not that race, because of historical conditions, is a proxy for class, which actually I think is somewhat true. I mean, I think race is not simply that, but it does develop in that context. And
it's more than that. It's our, we have impulses. But anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but and like, because like dealing with like xenophobia and bigotry would probably still be around, but the this focus on it. One thing that Abraham X. Kendi did that I thought was super damaging is there have been a tendency on the left over the past say 40, 50 years to finally split up racism, not just from like legally defined bigotry, but also like implicit bias and systemic racism and stuff like that. And what Kendi does is his starting proposition is, you know, those distinctions, you know how those are different things? Well, they're not different things because they're all racism. Yeah. And we should talk about them interchangeably with the same word. Because
but even worse is, oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Well, so, you know, when I was younger, the word racism, and for everyone who went to school before 2010, basically, almost anyone, the word racism just meant the attitude of racism, the belief that there are different races and some are better than others. The, you know, xenophobia, basically what we call discrimination. But after 2010, they changed it to racism is prejudice plus power. It's the system of racial hierarchies. And they confused in one term what you used to call systemic racism, right? And what you call the attitude of racism. And the people who did this were these white anti-racist activists who were running seminars on racism, that like these anti-racist seminars, and they found that the white people were super annoying because they were just like, well, what about when black people hate white people? That's racism too, isn't it? And they're like, well, you're missing the point. So their solution to this problem was not to just explain why it's different, but they just like, no, racism is only white people can be racist because racism is a structure, but it's also a feeling. And that creates such garbage because when you go talk to somebody and you say, well, black people can't be racist, they're like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense because racism is a feeling. Oh, no, it's the system of oppression. You know, I'm Jewish, so if I'm in Israel, I can be racist. But then if I go to Saudi Arabia, I can't be racist. You're talking to this person for 45 minutes trying to explain this term that they thought they understood, and just like, what are you talking about? You're not doing anybody any favors. You're just creating chaos and confusion. And then there's a tendency, it's very seductive to say, oh, I can't be racist because racism just applies to the dominant group. But the normal person who listens to that is going to think like, oh, you can't be racist because you're better than me, because you're a special, different being than I am. And that's what all this crap is sort of doing inadvertently, is essentializing different racial groups. Like, you can never understand a black person. You can never understand a woman if you're a man. You can never understand this and that. Everybody is so completely, it's like biological racism without the biology, you know? It's like this crazy ass essentialist bonkers, and it's not helping. Like, you know, and the word white privilege, what that describes is a very important concept. If a black person and a white person who are equal socioeconomically, the black person has more disadvantages, extra disadvantages that the white person doesn't have. But the word privilege means that you have something that you don't deserve. I got a legacy admission to a university because that's a privilege. I get free tickets to see the Rolling Stones because my dad is their manager. That's a privilege. And a privilege implies that you have something that you don't deserve that should be taken away from you. So when you say white privilege to a poor white person, they instinctively feel like you want to take away something from them. And so that's the worst word to, it's like a word designed to create racial conflict instead of creating the racial solidarity that you want to create. You know,
I mean, we have seen this come up
like
explicitly recently when they were talking, when there was this whole discussion about scabbing for relatively elite professors who were of color.
Yeah.
And they started talking about, well, privilege, blah, blah, blah. And this is one of the few times where like even the academy was like,
fuck you.
Like, this is ridiculous.
They're arguing that it's a privilege to be able not to scab.
Right.
They're saying it's
yeah. So I was like,
some people paid $2,000 to go to this conference, and they can't not go because.
So I was like, okay, this is where we're at. but I mean, and in a way, it's like, well, thank God, because this is saying the quiet part loud. I used to talk about this, all the time. I was like, look, if you look at there's a couple places where you look at rhetoric shifts that are actually kind of telling. So when privilege discourse was first introduced, it was about white skin privilege, and it was talking about white skin privilege and underprivileged people.
No.
In comparison to underprivileged people, like poor black people, right?
Poor white people. That's what they're comparing.
Right. And then this gets flattened out in Education Pedagogy by Peggy McClintock into the Invisible Knapsack Privilege essay, which is a terrible essay because one of the things that it assumes is a lot of things that she calls white are specifically for white upper middle class people. Like,
right, yeah, they do.
It's like
all the time. They do this all the time. Yeah.
And I'm like, so you've universalized your own class experience as what it means to be white, and you've also extended that to all white people.
That's that stupid white supremacy memo. All the stuff they describe is just poor people versus white rich people. Like, that's that whole memo. Being on time. Yeah, being on time is if you come from a certain socioeconomic class where you have a job that you have to be on every day versus somebody who is a peasant or doesn't have a job. Like, you don't have to be on time. Fuck you. Yeah.
I saw that, and I was just like, I actually saw the beginnings of that 15 years ago, and I was like, oh, some of these traits that they're calling white, these are clearly economic traits, and they're economic traits that don't exist amongst all white people.
Yeah, exactly. Or they all racism in healthcare, and there's racism in healthcare, but then you see this list of things. I'm like, that's just poor people. That's every poor person gets treated this way. Like, most of these. There are some things that are specific to black people, which are important to talk about, but you're just you're turning everything into race war where it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. There are things that where like people assume that like black people are somehow more robust and have less pain and stuff like that. So there's like that, and that to me is like, well, okay, that's clearly racist, and we can talk about that. But you're equating all these other things to race. What I find fascinating about this, and when I really became convinced that Adolf Reed had a point,
I like it.
Was that when I started seeing that black poverty has been largely unmoved in the last 30 years. And in fact, it got worse in 2007 and never recovered.
Yeah.
And then that there is a pretty extreme racial wealth gap, even among the like lower middle class, but it is the entire bit of it is explained, if you look at the numbers, by home ownership and home ownership stats because of redlining, which means that
also inheritance. It's just the fact of inheritance. Black people couldn't own property for so long, so they just don't have as much inheritance. If you're a professional class black person, you're like a first generation homeowner or not, or you're not a homeowner at all, right? Because it's too expensive and you just never got into that class. Your parents didn't hand you even the middle class people, you buy your home because your parents gave you inheritance,
right?
Like
So there's a glass floor for certain kinds of white people, and there's not a glass floor for black people. That's absolutely true. But that gets extended to all white people as if and I'm not saying this pity the poor white guy, but like, there's a whole lot of white people who don't have inheritance from property because they either came over late or they never had it in the first place. They were lower class, like farm workers and shit,
or whatever happened. There's always everyone has a different route to being poor and dispossessed. It's just that most black people, American descendants of slaves, all have the same route.
Right. And I think we have to deal with that. And this is why I'm one of these people. We can't throw anti-racism out of our plank because it's real, but equating it in this equity way.
Yeah.
What that has done. Okay, so one of the things about affirmative action, for example, because I was one of these people who was like, well, it's not going to change anything. And you're like, what? I'm like, no, it's not going to change anything, because a lot of the diversity quotient right now, in so much that it's being met by children of generational black wealth, which is small, but it does exist.
Yeah.
in immigrants.
Yeah, that's the thing is Nigerian immigrants, Ghanaian immigrants, Jamaican immigrants are just getting all the benefits. Like 40%. It was at Harvard in 2018. Harvard finally achieved racial proportionality for Black people. At least 15% of America is Black. 15% of freshmen were Black, but 44% of those were from Nigeria and people who'd never been slaves. It's like, what are you doing? Like, that's nice. It's like, I guess it's good because it's good. Well, look, elite education just reproduces elites. That's the whole point of Harvard, right? So they're like, okay, well, let's have a rainbow of elites because maybe they'll rule more justly, or just legitimizes the elite. But the whole point, you want to get rid of those damn institutions in the first place, right? Like, those institutions are bad to begin with. Their mission is not good. Even if they're good, you might get a good education there in various ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is my whole point about, and it's funny because even some, like, I have seen some non-socialist liberals even recently admit this, is they were like, okay, well, we didn't actually fix conditions for Black people in a way which they ever could compete beyond affirmative action, and affirmative action wasn't used to primarily help poor Black people either. So we really have failed. And if you look at like the plight of inner city schools in America, and this is despite this is not actually a money issue. We throw tons of money at this, but it's the way it is managed and run. Okay. Where you just see like, well, these schools have been hollowed out, and any progressive, and this is one of the things that's made conservatism more popular, is these elites implementing progressive reforms, such as, like, say, restorative justice are in schools. You know what restorative justice has meant?
I mean, I know what it means in Canada. It's interesting. It's based on a Native American. You force the guy who did something bad to you to go fix it. Some kids graffitied your lawn. Instead of putting them in jail, they go and fix your lawn and fix your house and see the damage they've done and learn something and make a connection with the person that they've harmed. And it's pretty good. Even works for terrible crimes to an extent.
I was about to say I'm pro restorative justice, and it's interesting because like it's indigenous, but also like my dudes, even fucking Vikings had this fucking like it's like
good. It's human.
Yeah. Communal societies, that's what they do, because they don't want to devote resources to prisons. That's a lot of resources.
And it's bonkers when you think of how much it costs to keep someone in prison versus giving them the stuff that would de-incentivize them from doing crimes in the first place. Yeah.
It's bonkers from the standpoint of all of society, but I actually think it's perfectly rational from a standpoint of the bourgeoisie, because they will lose power over the general population if they don't have that discipline mechanism.
Well, it's like why it's illegal to go fish through the garbage of McDonald's, because that will harm McDonald's ability to sell sandwiches. Because I'll go get take from the garbage. Why wouldn't I? Not just homeless people. I'll go fucking eat from the garbage if it's there, right? It's antithetical. Capitalism requires all of these injustices to function.
So, this focus on equity has been a way to like change nothing. I mean, like,
and by equity, just so people understand, when Ibram X. Kendi and everybody else in Kamala Harris talks about equity, what they just mean is correct racial proportions. So when Ibram X. Kendi talks about, inequity, what's inequity? Inequity is when 40% of homeowners of white people are homeowners, but only 10% of Black people are homeowners. Equity would be if 40% of white people are homeowners and 40% of Black people are homeowners. But the flip side of that is if you think, well, 25% of homeless people are Black, but only 15% of homeless people of Americans are Black. Therefore, it should be 15%. But that just means that to make that things equitable, you need to put more Chinese people and more white people and more Jewish people into homelessness. That doesn't fix the problem. Is homelessness. It's like if the slavery abolitionists had said, well, the problem with slavery is that it's 100% Black instead of 15% Black and 65% white and 30% Latino. Like it's bonkers. And that's why Ibram Kendi gets to go speak at Amazon, and he gets a Genius grant, and he gets all this stuff, is because there's zero threat in there. As radical as the language sounds of what he's saying, there's zero threat in there to the ruling class. It's perfect. You can pretend to be for social justice and do absolutely nothing to help anybody except for you shuffle around some people so you'll benefit. And I don't want to, in a way, I feel bad sometimes shitting on affirmative action because there are people who are cool, good people who got to go to Harvard. Yeah, they're upper middle class or they're middle class, but hey, they got a great experience. I don't want to take that away from you. I'm not saying that, oh, no, you don't deserve, you should take away. It's the whole system is wrong to begin with.
Yeah, no, my thing about affirmative action is it did diversify a professional managerial class. And the first diversification was actually white women. And then also white passing immigrants, Italians. My ancestors actually as part of, and your ancestors as part of the Jewish great off-white hard. Yeah, my Jewish people and Slavs in my case, and Scottish people. Like
they still had anti-Jewish quotas when my dad went to school. Like he got in despite the quota, and he was also an immigrant. He was the wrong kind of Jew that's not supposed to get in, but he was lucky he had good grades. Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't realize he was a dirty Sephardic Jew.
Yeah, exactly.
Good white Ashkenazi Jews.
But it actually worked for him because he's from a francophone country, and Quebec, so they're trying to also get more francophones in. So they're like, okay, yeah, it's different. But yeah.
I mean, I come from a rarity. A Scotch-Irish family that married into a Slavic, a Slavic Sephardic family, in the South,
right.
already crazy weird in itself, and who are poor. Yeah. Like
Sephardic Jews, a lot of them, but yeah, they came here pretty poor. Like, my dad used to have to walk to school for an hour and a half, or my uncle had to walk to work for an hour and a half every day, right? Because you couldn't afford the bus, and they had to get all these there's a lot of good Jewish charities. That's how they got to go to school and stuff, even though, and it's interesting. My dad talks about his family. He's like, okay, so there's different Jews went from when they left Morocco, they went to primarily France, Canada, and the US, mostly Los Angeles, but also other places. And he said that if you look at his own family, like brothers and sisters and cousins, the cousins who went to France, all doctors. The people who went to Canada, all less teachers. My uncle's an engineer, my dad's a school teacher. So, okay, middle class, but in the middle class, not the upper middle class. And then in the States, couldn't afford to finish school, couldn't afford to go to school. Or luckily one woman got a bachelor's degree, and she had some kind of government job. You just see the effects of the class systems in each country.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about that with Sephardic Jews in America is the first wave of Jewish immigrants to the United States were actually Sephards who left Spain, went to Britain when they relaxed the British.
The first Jews were Sephardic in Canada. Right. Yeah, the oldest synagogue in Canada, which is in Montreal, is a Sephardic synagogue established in 17 something. Yeah.
So the Sephardic in my family was a mixture of these old Sephardic Jews who came over actually with the founding of the country, and then a second wave that came over in the early 20th century that they both, interestingly, you're right, they both came through France. And they got together, but they were basically farm workers. I mean, and we had some people get into government education during the GI Bill for serving in World War II and become doctors and stuff, but most of the people stayed poor. And they married into, and then eventually a lot of them converted to Catholicism are to mainline Protestant Christianity because they married into Scotch-Irish families to normalize. So that's my ancestry, and interestingly, it's my Jewish part that has ties to this. So far, this is what the irony of we've talked about this before, but I have ties to Montreal, Nova Scotia, Louisiana, and Georgia because my Jewish part of my family traveled with French people. They were always hanging out with the Acadians. So,
I have the right to Portuguese citizenship because my grandmother's family has a Portuguese last name. Anyways, it's complicated, but yeah.
Oh yeah, because there's that whole Portuguese thing, and it's been fought in the EU forever, where they're like, if you're a Sephardic Jew, we'll recognize you as a citizen for right of return, going all the way back to 1492. And my family doesn't have the right last names, and I can't document it. But I was like, that's crazy.
I actually applied for it, and they don't tell you this, which is super annoying, because I went through this whole process. I had to get a letter from the rabbi. I had to show the documentation, which is rough for people of my grandparents' age, but I found the documentation and I applied, and it was supposed to be a €200 fee or something like that. And I was like, okay, I scraped that together. And then you have to get it approved by the Jewish organization of one of the Portuguese cities of Porto. And they're like, okay, now you have to give us $1,000. I was like, what? Why are you telling me this at the end of the fucking process? So I couldn't afford it, and I just never did it. But I wanted, anyways, as soon as I have some money to blow, I want to do that.
It is a way to get an EU passport.
Yeah, exactly. Total EU passport could be useful. Who knows what's going to happen in the next, couple decades.
When my country invades your country, and
yeah, that's real. For the water resources, like that's a thing.
Yeah. My favorite thing is like Canadians being paranoid about that, and I have Canadian friends and some Canadian family even. I'm always like, well, you should be. Like, just frankly,
exactly. I remember when they're talking about a lot of the free trade stuff. They're just like, oh yeah, basically we're opening the door for U.S. to colonize all of our water resources, and if there's ever droughts, we won't be able to. It'll be like the Irish potato famine all over again, where we won't have access to our own water, but you guys will. Yeah.
I mean, if you're lucky, we'll just conquer you and make you Americans. But like,
yeah, exactly.
But dark humor aside, where there's like this perverse way in which through American post neoliberalism we finished the War of 1812 in our favor. It's just like 300-year revenge. It began with NAFTA. It's the one thing I worry about right now is I, like you, feel like I look at a left that all parts of it, and I do mean all parts of it, have picked up different right-wing ideologies. So now, like, everyone hates that, like the MAGA communist patriotic socialist movement, but I think they hate it because they're saying the quiet.
What?
Oh, it's this weird. It's a mostly online thing. It's incredibly popular online, but it has no institutions. Where they're like, we need to be socialist to support Donald Trump, and we need to support Russia, and they're all but national Bolsheviks, basically.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting about them is they're also like, the entire world's already communist because you have social goods. Seriously, some of them make this argument.
God, you need to be American to think like that. Like, oh, what? You got a free COVID test?
Well, what's interesting is this leadership actually does come from recent immigrants to the United States. Like, it's not from people who are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's made to appeal to like very alienated, like people who came under in the Bernie campaign and got burnt by liberal culture. There's lots of PMC talk, anti-PMC talk in that in it. But I think what a lot of people hate is it says a lot of the quiet parts out loud.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
we have given up on anything like true class abolition. We just want like a ruler who's going to be like nicer to the working class.
Yeah.
We have given up on. So what's interesting about the MAGA communists is they're both like, they're not racial chauvinists, and that way they're not like national Bolsheviks, but they are like, well, these Trumpist right Republicans, they really represent the working class's actual ideology. And I'm like, no, they don't. But in some ways, like the fear
like
of
culture
talking,
war stuff. Like,
so we need to tail them on culture war stuff. But I'm like,
I don't know. Most working class people I know either don't care about culture stuff that much, or kind of open-minded about it, even if they might have some conservative leanings. They're like, whatever, it's not me. I don't care.
Well, the rigidness of cultural and racial politics seems to be a middle class phenomenon.
Yeah,
and yes, like that does mean that it does take up part of the upper end of the working class. But like one of the things I used to talk about to people that I saw in my family, I had some pretty horribly racist working class people in my family, but what I always found interesting in them is that they worked with black people all the time and they were constantly making exceptions to their racism.
Right.
Whereas, which is not to say it is okay. Like, I'm not saying it at all. But whereas I would work with upper middle class white people who said all the right things, but they would be afraid to come to my neighborhood because it was like 40% of color.
Yeah. They tend to be afraid of anyone who's working class because they only know. The thing is, what I figured out, or what I think is, middle class culture, especially upper middle class culture, is predicated on purging yourself of all those things about you that are working class, like incorrect grammar, dressing a certain way, holding yourself a certain way. Like everything you're doing is signaling that you're not. Do you know what I mean? Like everything you're doing is signaling that you are appropriately cultured, and so many things that a working class person does is like a direct. It's everything you're not supposed to do as a upper middle class person. So they're kind of like petrified, like they don't know what to do with you. You know, they're like scared of you. You know what I mean?
I not just know what you mean. I think about it in myself. So when I got educated and moved up from like blue collar labor into like white collar labor, I rejected for a long time any signs of my working class origins in myself. So much so that my accent's different. Like I have a normalized accent.
My dad, they used to roll their R's. Everyone in Morocco rolled their R's. And you'd see that the people like my dad, who had a middle class existence, doesn't stop rolling his. He stopped rolling his R's when he came, and also, anyways, in Morocco. But then I have other more working class parts of that family who still roll their R's. You know, it's a total class identification thing. Yeah.
And this is one of the things where I am sort of like, well, Mark says you need to read Pierre Badiou because we don't talk about like this cultural habitat stuff and the way you show and signal culture. And that's, that my feeling about parts of the PM thesis is, but that part is real. So there's this way in which a lot of downwardly mobile proletarian, Christian Parenti actually wrote something about this in Compact. And Compact's a mess. It's not, I don't endorse those politics at all. No. But he wrote something that I think was actually quite true, that you have a lot of formerly working class, in the blue collar sense, people who are wage laborers and being proletarianized, but who are fighting tooth and nail not to be re-identified with the class they come from.
Right. Yeah.
And also, even though their objective interests are often in the same places as what would be good for blue collar workers, not always. There are some differences. Like while I'm for the complete revitalization of student debt and making college different, like the over focus on that is like a very like, well, that's because it affects younger people and a strata of like the precarious middle class more. There is a sense where, like, I mean, frankly, people like me who do not want to fall back into their origins, and a lot of their origins, frankly, were traumatic. Like growing up poor is not good for you. Like,
Buddy comes from like the total poorest class of Quebec society, and you hear him talk about his family or whatever, and he has like fucking PTSD just talking about what they would eat, what they'd do. Like, it's fucking hilarious hearing him talk about it, but you get disturbed. You're like, fuck, man,
Right. And so it took, in my case, it took me actively trying, and it's a struggle, to not be like, everything where I come from is gross and bad.
It's
because
garbage.
Yeah, because, and I'm going to embrace this upper class lifestyle. And I will totally admit, it informs my taste. It does inform my taste. But one of the things that I have really realized in the past 10 years is the elites are easier to idolize when you don't know them.
Right.
But once you do, you're just like, well, fuck this.
And my dad is like that too. Exactly. He gets along better with the poor person than with the rich person. It's the way that you like the refinement. You like ease of life or the confidence that they hold themselves with, but then you're like everything underneath that is like the lizard people. It's disgusting. It's like maggots rotting eating.
Yeah, it's just like it's 1,000. It's like 4 generations of nepo baby decadence, and there's nothing left. Like,
my friend is a lawyer, and he went from Quebec to British Columbia,
mm-hmm.
and he hates it there because he said in Quebec, if you're, because the only people who could afford, I do a special kind of law that's for basically poor people, but if most lawyers, your clientele is going to be the rich people, right? That's the only people who can afford you. And in Quebec, if you're rich, you probably became rich. You probably had to start your own company or do something. Even if you're generationally rich, you usually had to do something to get or maintain that wealth. But in British Columbia, you're like 7th generation rich person. And he said they have that sense of entitlement that rich people have, but none of the competence and ability to do anything, so you give them homework and they don't do it. And then they get mad at you for it's like awful. Yeah.
No, well, I should be very careful on how I state this. As I now teach in a public school system that, and particularly where I'm at, I actually teach a WAD class strata as well as a fairly broad race strata. Although I teach mostly Latin and Pacific Islanders as far as people of color. But one of the things I pointed out is like, I can tell the difference in the different kinds of wealthy people, both upper middle class and true wealthy, because the generationally wealthy people are entitled, but they don't do shit. And when I dealt with like, say, rich people in the developing world, and I mean, I would say rich people, I mean mega rich people, like the true 1% of the 1%. I worked for them for a little while, and they didn't tolerate crap from their kids, but like a lot of these families who are rich off of land speculation or recent investments, they totally do. Like it's all about like, we're going to try to gain whatever advantage we can. These kids don't have to do anything. They get mad when you
monsters.
Yeah. And so I don't want to make it sound like, oh, there's different kinds of rich people, but there kind of are. Like,
there are, for sure. There's the ones who have to do stuff, and there's the ones who don't have to do stuff, or there's the ones who have to do stuff that's complicated and requires discipline, and then there's the landlords who like I fight landlords for a living, right? And you see, if you start a business, you have to have some brains in your head to start that business and to maintain that business and to deal with all the things you have to deal with. But to be a landlord, the biggest fucking imbecile can be a landlord. All you have to be is a thug and know how to bully people and just use your equity to buy more apartments and bully more tenants. Like I'm shocked at how fucking stupid some of these people are. Like, and they're zillionaires. Like, you can't even wipe your own ass. I guess I can't tell the confidentiality, but people who, oh my God, the guy's gonna. Anyways, I can't tell the story.
Yeah, I get you. But like,
somebody who's gonna destroy gonna destroy themselves publicly because they're too dumb to pay a tenant some money that they're owed and that they deserve, and they're gonna humiliate themselves in a court, and they're gonna have a published decision about them, calling them a fraudster, calling them this and that. But they still couldn't do it. They couldn't stop themselves. Like, they can't. It's like too dumb. It's unbelievable.
I mean, to me, the difference in this really shows up in the difference in our millionaires, and our billionaires, trillionaires, whatever the fuck they are, in the United States. So, for example, there are these awful robber barons of the 19th century, but they were fairly smart, and
they usually got their. Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
Something.
They did something, and a lot of them actually come from it's that first generation of settler colonial wealth. You actually can come from nothing.
Yeah.
They're brutal people, but there was a brutal intelligence to them. You didn't deal with someone like Warren Buffett, who is smart but genteel. He's done a lot of investments. He's not ostentatious. Then you get to people like, and then Bill Gates. Then you get to Zuck and Bezos and Musk, and these are people who most of their wealth even comes from like government subsidies keeping them up, and rent, and just total rent seeking behavior for their entire career. And you're like, at best, these people are idiot savants who are good at one thing, and there's some evidence that they're not even that.
They're not even good at that. They just got lucky.
Right.
time, and they were good at screwing their partner over who did all the work. And
right. But so you're just looking at this, and I'm like, I feel like I've seen my like the elites of this country get worse and worse and worse and worse, and then you sort of go, well, I get why these people are like would side, like, okay, like you pick a nepo baby like Donald Trump, but he's less of a nepo baby than some of these people, honestly.
Really? Because like Bezos and Gates, like at least they did something.
Well,
like,
Bezos is an interesting transition
like
figure.
Jared Kushner, who just like inherited this monstrous landlord empire, and he's just this horrible brute. Yeah.
Well, but you're right about the difference between kinds of rentiers, even. So, like, what Trump is a landlord.
Yeah.
And what, but he's kind of tied into productive industry and land values. And what a lot of these other people are people who valued off of government speculation and government contracts. And so what you see in both of them is a decadence that you, like, if I look at like, I don't want to like idealize prior periods of capitalism because they were just as brutal, but they were different. Like, it's very hard to imagine, like, for example, the Brahmin wealth that led to FDR, right? Doing what we see Musk doing. And then the only real opposition you can see to them are these brutal, like, localish, basically landlord thugs. And in a lot of small towns in the United States, those people dominate the local economy at a local level. Like, and so you see this fight between the Elon Musk of the world and basically the Trumps. Well, not the Musk so much anymore, but like the Bezoses of the world and the Trumps of the world. And I'm sorry, in a way, like, they're both thuggish nepo babies, but there's a vitality to one of them that is more appealing to a certain kind of person than there is to this, like, oh, well, this person has like made money off of rent-seeking behavior their entire life, but they've done it in a very like genteel but sneaky way. And you all of a sudden see all these other, like, you can see the lizard people stereotype, the way that anti-Semitism works. I mean, like, you see all these things sneak in because you're like, oh, okay, I get how this is breaking down, because this person looks like, well, at least, they're a brutal metal baby who didn't earn shit, but at least they can boss people around. Whereas these other people, it's like, how did they get money? Like, we don't even know how they got money. Like, and you can also see on the right, and sometimes even on the left, I think people underestimate this, how this leads to destructive conspiracy theorizing, because it's just like, I don't know how those people got rich. Like, they don't seem competent, they don't seem strong, they're not even good bullies. I don't know how they got rich.
And you're so far from that world that you can't understand how it actually works, so you have to invent this lizard people or whatever it is, because that's the only thing that can make sense.
Right, because you like the idea that these people got rich off of government contracts and rent seeking and like surviving off of the interest of the money that other people before them have earned. They don't even need to make new money. Like, they don't need to produce anything to maintain their wealth. And you just sort of realize, like, oh, this is a problem. And then all of a sudden something clicked in my mind. And this is one of the many reasons why I quit being kind of paleo conservative, is when I realized that, like, okay, maybe it was real that those first robber baron people really did work up from nothing, but what they did it, no one else could. Like, it was
just a moment in time there was a gap. They happened to be the one that filled in that gap, and they had some abilities that won them that position versus somebody else, but that's it. It's done. That position is not available anymore.
Right. And it's like, so you have a heroic one period, and that's the period you're going to focus on forever, because it's the only time that looks like this could possibly be fair.
Right. Yeah.
And and that's something that I think right now in America, if you're talking about that on class terms, it does look like the only people talking about now are like these Josh Hawleys or Sohrab Amaris or whatever.
Yeah.
And some of them, I think, are more sincere in their socialistic beliefs than others.
Yeah, well, Sohrab Arami seems serious about what he's talking about. Josh
Right.
Hawley, believe him for a second. Marco Rubio, like these guys just figured out, oh, this shit is popular. It's like when Kamala Harris was advocating for universal health care, and the donors who were literally going to her from the pharmaceutical industry, going to her, donor parties, were telling reporters, yeah, this is just bullshit. I know this isn't real, right?
Right. So, I mean, and they proved that they didn't mean it. Like how it's not just how few Democratic promised reforms that we heard during the Trump era didn't happen. It's also like how little of the Trump policies did they even reverse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like our immigration regime is actually worse. Our tariff wars with China are worse.
That's like in Canada. Stephen Harper, the conservative guy, basically put the death spike into Canadian healthcare, and then Trudeau gets. It's so interesting. It's so sad how Trudeau got elected. There's going to be the Social Democratic guy that there's called NDP. It's basically a Social Democratic Party. They were ahead. So Harper, the conservative, had been in power for like 10 years. Okay, and people were just sick of him, and they were going to vote for an alternative. And it looked like for the first time, the Prime Minister of Canada was going to be a Social Democratic Party at the NDP. This guy, Tom Mulcair, who's like a light social democrat, but whatever, he was there. It's like the first time I ever voted for an MP who got elected. And so he sadly he criticized in Quebec, they had this like racist law which prohibits people from wearing any religious symbols in government service. So like a woman with a hijab couldn't, be a teacher potentially, but you could still wear. They still had a giant cross in the National Assembly. Like that was
very French of them.
That was okay. But if you wore a Jewish star or a kippah or a hijab, like that wasn't okay. It was just directed at Muslims because there was like an anti-Muslim panic for like a couple of years. So he criticized that. All of a sudden, his popularity in Quebec tanks, and then they're like, "Oh, he's not." The rest of Canada, who's still like Mulcair, the Social Democrat guy, were like, he might not win against Harper, so we're just all going to vote for Trudeau because he's, so they just all of a sudden, all the polls just shifted towards Trudeau because of that. And Trudeau gets elected. He doesn't he's letting the healthcare die. Media didn't really cover what's going on. So he's just like, yeah, these guys get elected. They do fucking nothing to change anything. All the Harper policies still there. He put some rainbow stuff on there. It's nicer about women, nicer about gays, nicer about trans. And that's it. The healthcare system's going to die.
Right. And on our side, what we have is actually the right has actually progressed further at the state level than it did under Trump, which is like
the Obama era, like the Republicans took over all the states basically.
And during this Biden era, like, I mean, Florida is like the most extreme example of it, but even places like New Hampshire are like doing stuff that you're like, whoa, like you're gonna be. It's pretty clear that you're building up to like try to recriminalize LGBT stuff altogether.
Yeah. They're just like, it's crazy. Yeah.
In Florida, you started seeing neo-Confederate stuff being pandered to, and like we're gonna defund federal holidays like Juneteenth and Martin Luther King Day because fuck those guys. It's like wow, and it doesn't have a lot of comport over national politics. Admittedly, like that's not attractive. Like we're seeing this with DeSantis, it's not attractive,
right,
to the majority of the country. But
it is affecting millions of people in there.
But yeah, it affects tons of people in these states. And one of the interesting things that I pointed out, okay, so Georgia,
when there's no class politics, like that's what you're left with,
right? Georgia, which is a quote purple state, right? The same reactionaries that ran it when I was there run it now. It just now sends moderate Democrats to the Senate, and it may sometimes give its electoral vote college back to Democrats, but locally there's almost been no change in local politics at all.
But it's also like it's just who's scapegoating? Who are you going to scapegoat? You're either going to scapegoat the gay people, or Black people, Mexican immigrants, or on the other side, you're going to scapegoat the white people who vote for those parties. Like, Trump is the scapegoat. Or, I mean, he's doing the bad thing, but the white working class who supposedly supports Trump they're the scapegoat. Like everything is a scapegoat. There's no class politics. There's nothing going to help anybody. Let's just blame some group that we can shit on.
Right. I mean, this is one of the things that I pointed out to people way back in the day. I'm like, so the average Republican voter makes over $100,000 a year and under $250,000 a year, which means that they're kind of a party of the lower upper middle class, are truly
the rich people in the poor areas.
Right. Yeah. And yes, they wear cowboy boots and drive a pickup truck, but that pickup truck is effectively a luxury car that's over $100,000 retail, and those cowboy boots cost $200.
Yeah,
like they have the affectation of working class people, and they are more relatable for that reason. But working class people can't afford that shit.
Yeah. Like, one of the interesting things about today is how the signifiers of class have completely melted. And you'll have Elon Musk has the same habits and styles and tastes as somebody who works at McDonald's. Like that's incredibly new. That's really 1960s.
Elite people going to see Marvel movies. It's like it's like,
you know, you think of FDR and his accent and his demeanor compared to, you know, Trump or whatever, who thinks exactly like my uncles in Florida. Like that's why they like him, because he has the same affect or the same whatever. Yeah. Well, I have some family related in Moroccan Jewish circles. Basically, everyone's your family because it's kind of this weird inbreeded circle. You just call everyone your uncle, even if they're not really related to you. But there's this family that one of them is a union organizer. He started as a college union organizer, and the other one's some finance guy. And the finance guy is mega rich, and the union organizer guy is like middle class. And the middle class guy loves to wear the most expensive, fancy clothes all the time. He wants the best shirt. He wants a car. Like he loves that stuff. He's obsessed with like status markers. Whereas the super rich guy is like driving a quiet Honda. Like there's like the mega rich now have this sort of obsession with not looking rich. It's this weird thing, but yeah.
In fact, it's now wearing a tracksuit to work actually indicates that you're the boss. Like,
right, because you're the only one who could get away with it.
Right, but actually, this is something that I've been pointing out to people for a while, and it seems progressive at first, but it's actually kind of not. So it used to be you could learn the codes of, like, we talk about this now. This has pernicious effects. Talk about how like I suppressed all of my class coding for being like a working class white kid from the South. That's all suppressed now, including the way I talk. However, it doesn't matter anymore. Part of that, I think, is the internet, because like, but like the whole cultural capital, it seems like the elites have more or less just given up on that. Like we no longer even going to try to do that.
I just think it's homogenization because mass media exists where it didn't used to exist. I think the Beatles are good. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you're going to like the Beatles. You like rap music, you're going to like it whether you're rich or poor, you know?
Right. So and it's impossible to cordon off access.
Yeah, like before, to go to the orchestra cost $100, and only rich people could go do it. Now it's like everyone could listen to everything.
Tune in the NPR, get on Spotify, so it doesn't signify anything anymore.
Yeah.
And so these taste markers are all mixed up, but that can be highly like confusing.
There's little symbols though that they have their own little markers. They're just very discreet. You wouldn't notice it, but notice it.
Yeah, I was about to say there are still small things you'll see. But one of the interesting things about the pandemic, for example, is the growth of luxury goods sales to people in the United States who make under $40,000 a year.
Really?
And it's massively engrossed. Part of it is a lot of these poor people see it as an investment.
Okay, like
they think they can resell it.
Like what are they buying?
Designer bags, designer shoes.
Okay.
The other thing is, and this was pointed out to someone, is you are indicating that you have status because this is being shared through like these trends are being shared on like TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to try to get into what you think is the code for the circles of the witch, you're going to buy these things.
I see.
But they don't actually carry status with them anymore.
Right.
And if you're trying to like get ahead and you're like, well, I need to look rich so I can try to get a job, I should look the part. And yet, and you can't save for a house anymore. That's like not reachable. So all the other ways of accumulating wealth seem closed off to you. It's actually not totally irrational to do this. You'll get your David Brooks of the world, be like, oh, see those poor people, they're so stupid. But that is what's kind of happening. And it's drying up because a lot of that, even with the credit, a lot of that money was based off of cheap credit, and then it was also based off of people not having to pay back student loans. But
interesting.
So wow. it's actually been sauntering down. But I think that's interesting because I think you're right now. One of the things that I've seen people get in real trouble in academia for saying, but is like, don't you realize that the diversity statement is a show of class? Because to write it correctly, you need to have had a ton of leisure time that you devoted solely to specific kinds of political activism that you have to know from correct circles which ones they are.
Oh wow.
And you can fake it too if you know the code words, but to learn the code words requires you to have access to power and wealth.
Well, that's exactly like having to dress the right way. Because if you dress like a flashy pimp, that's the wrong way. And you have to know the discreet, people who go to fancy universities can't get a job afterwards. They go to like the finance school, and if they're not hanging out in the right clubs and in the right associations, once they go get a job, the boss can tell immediately that you're not one of them. Because, you're wearing a rich, expensive shoe, but it's a square-toed shoe, and you're not supposed to wear a square-toed shoe. You have to wear, this year you're wearing a round-toe shoe. Square-toed shoes was 2 years ago. Oh, you're wearing an expensive watch, but you're wearing a watch that's one grade ahead of what you're supposed to be wearing. You're supposed to be wearing this expensive watch that's $1,000 less than that one. Like, there's all these rules that you can only learn by being in that milieu. I never thought of the diversity statements as that. I just thought of them as like a signifier of submission to authority. Like, I am going to do, it's like the disciplined minds thesis. It's just like, I'm going to do whatever you tell me to do. So here's my
I actually think
it's proof of obedience, right?
Well, one of the things I will tell you in the United States, and you probably know this, but economic diversity amongst students has declined dramatically in the last decade.
No, I didn't even know.
Yeah. So one of the things, and the two trends that back that, and this is what's fucked up, man. Progressives are supporting these trends. Is the focus on diversity as the primary means of proving your thing, and thus personal statements and diversity statements are crucial to the admissions process, and the removal of standardized tests, which why they have racial and ethnic biases, and they do. What people don't realize, or they ignore, is actual teacher given grades have more racial ethnic biases.
Yeah, and it also makes you depend more on the interview and on the letter and all that stuff, which people hire tutors to learn how to write those letters. They hire, all the other stuff is cultural signifiers, or that you paid somebody to get you that stuff done to look good on your CV or whatever. Yeah.
Which means all these informal systems of wealth actually are more important now, not less. And
I didn't realize that tanked the amount of poor people in schools. I didn't realize it had that effect already. Yeah.
There's a bunch of reasons. A lot of poor people also just they're no longer even applying. But for example, if you're a lower middle class kid and you come to me and ask me how to get into college, I literally can't tell you. No one knows.
Really?
Because it's like
criteria. Yeah.
Because all the there's been such a move away from we're going to have these score cutoffs. We're going to have, it's all nebulous. But you know what? It's fucking funny is it still lines up to what's your zip code?
Right.
And do you know the right people? But now this is expressed in we're going to have diversity statements, etc. And the one thing I point out is getting rid of affirmative action isn't going to get rid of any of that. These are all things that, unless you start curtailing freedom of association and freedom of speech explicitly, it's going to be very hard.
Yeah.
But you've been pushing to remove these admittedly problematic standardized assessments and stuff because they're racially biased, and they are. but you've been replacing them with something that's actually
more
bias.
Yeah.
And not just racially biased, it's extremely class biased.
Which makes it racially biased by accident or by history.
Yeah. And so it's just like, but then again, if you're like one of these fairly rich people of color who benefited from this focus on equity, then you have there's no incentive for you to really do much about it. Like,
of course, you love that stuff. You know, you're very, very attached to it, and you think like Sotomayor that class is just a proxy for race because you're so indoctrinated with race essentialism, race, that you think class is a proxy for race, which is baffling to me that somebody at that level of education and power thinks that class is a proxy for race. And apparently Ibram X. Kendi thinks that too. I think we talked about before the show. One of people commented on my video that they went to an Ibram X. Kendi lecture and asked Ibram X. Kendi, well, how does your policies and your proposed policies help the working class? And Ibram X. Kendi apparently said, according to this commenter, the working class is just code for dog whistle for white people, and forget it. Next.
right, which is why, for example, according to his policy guides on how to decide if the policy is racist or anti-racist,
right,
even if it would objectively help more black people than white people, if it's not coded to be for that reason,
he thinks it's bad. He thinks it's bad. Yeah. Although he just put out an article. I feel like that critique must have reached him somehow, because he just put out an article saying the working class is not white.
Yeah, which is like,
how are you? You're the one saying this?
Okay. Which is like, duh.
It's a good article. It's interesting, but like, yeah.
I mean, the weird thing about X. Kendi, I mean, we've been shitting on him a lot, but one of the things about him that I find fascinating, for example, he actually critiqued the power plus privilege in his first book. Yeah, he talks about that in Stamped from the Beginning, that it's not a great... What did he replace it with? He replaces it with something worse. Like, he replaces it with like, all kinds of racism are the same because of their effects. Okay. Because whether it's bigotry,
right,
or
or
systemic racism or whatever, it leads to worse outcomes for black people. Therefore, they're effectively the same, but it's not because racism is power plus privilege. It's just we only care about consequences, and I'm like,
care about the results. We only care about the results. We only care about the
right. Results. Except this is the point that we were just said. Except when like the results are, I'm doing this thing that I'm not doing for anti-racist reasons
on the basis of class, even though it helps black people more. That's somehow
right.
Because we're not talking about race when we should be talking about race.
Right, and so then intention matters there.
That gives away the real motive, right? He just wants you to think about race. Like, that's all that is. He just wants you to think about race. He wants you to talk everything about race, think about race, never think about anything else. Only think about other things as a function of race, which is how you would think if you were rich.
Right. I mean, and I've actually talked
white
about
or black. Right, yeah.
For like 10 years. I was like, okay, think about it this way. If you're an upper middle class black person, what's the only real social inhibition to your life? Right? Particularly if you're a man, well, it's going to be identity struggles. It's going to be your race and your gender. And if you're a poor black person, well, yeah, you still have the problems of race and gender, but you have a fuckload of other problems.
Yeah, you can't get an apartment because you're black. You can't get a job because you're black. Those things are much more important than, somebody said, where are you from? It's I hate that. That's a bugaboo of mine. Yeah, like there's this interesting article I posted in my video about, even in upper middle class neighborhoods and wealthy neighborhoods, black people suffer from discrimination. And so it follows I forget, it's a lawyer, I think, and his wife works in the Defense Department. And they're just like, people are looking at us like, oh, how did you get here? Are you guys entertainers? Are you basketball players? I'm like, yeah, that's really annoying to go through that. But that's not a big, huge political issue that is tearing America apart, right? The political issue is the insane amount of poverty, the insane amount of inability to function in society because everything is in your way, right?
I was actually thinking about, James Baldwin, every triple white person's favorite anti-racist. But what I find interesting about Baldwin talks about this. He's like, look, the bigot doesn't concern me if you deal with the structural issues. Like that's their problem. Like,
exactly. That's the thing.
If they don't have power over policy, or if there's not large divisions of wealth, then it's kind of just, well, they're dicks and I can avoid them.
It's like what I said in my video. If you had a Star Trek world where there's replicators and there's no material conflicts, racism just becomes some asshole won't invite you to their party because they're a dick. And you don't care that much because it doesn't stop you from having a life. It becomes a political issue when you cannot function in society because your skin color is causing you to be harassed by the police, causing you to not be able to get an apartment, even though you can afford it, like all this crazy ass shit like that. It's the thing, because I was looking at microaggression stuff, and one thing that comes up a lot, and this is so American, and I don't understand it. Maybe you could explain it to me. When someone asks, "Oh, where are you from?" Right? In where I am, which is Anglo-Montreal is very immigrant, right? So when someone asks you, "Oh, where are you from?" that's usually a compliment because it means, oh, you're not just a McDonald's, Exxon Mobil gas station town roast beef eating Canadian person. You're from somewhere interesting. Tell me about yourself. Where are your parents from? Where are you from? You have an interesting story to tell me about who you are. And people like to be asked that and like to talk about it usually. But in the States, it's as if people, how dare you assume that I'm not a McDonald's eating Exxon Mobil small town person. No, I'm from Kansas. That's where I'm from. They get so offended by that. I don't understand.
I think it's actually because both in America, that question has both valences. There actually is a little bit of what you're talking about. Like, oh, well, you come from somewhere else. You must have worked your way here. That's impressive.
Yeah.
But there's also a sense in which, like, because there's so much nativism here where it's like, well, but you weren't born here.
From here. What are you really from?
Yeah. Where are you really from?
Yeah.
And I think part of that is because we have this is not that Canada isn't full of fucking racial nightmares in its history, but like, and
there were black towns that were not on maps, right? Because the Underground Railroad, black people escape from the U.S., go to Canada to freedom, except the authorities were so racist that you'd have entire cities and towns that were majority black, and they wouldn't put them on the map because, never mind the genocidal abuse of the Native Americans in the school system and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to say your first and indigenous people policies is just as bad as ours. So
but it's even worse. Did you guys have residential schools?
We did, yeah, but not actually. Your residential school system. So our residential schools were a real thing, but they tended to be run by states. Not the federal government, and they were like state coalitions with various church groups, Mormon, Catholic, etc. And they were as brutal as yours, but they didn't go on for as long. So yours lasted longer.
Yeah, and this, anyways, you want to cry, you read that. I can't read that stuff. It's too picturing little kids in these situations. Anyways. Whatever.
Yeah, it's a horrible thing.
That's genocide. Like you're destroying a culture systematically on purpose to take their resources. Like there's no other. You're just destroying people. Anyways, and at the abuse.
I remember getting 20 years ago getting in an argument with a conservative professor, even though I did not consider myself a leftist at this time, but he was talking about how, well, no one's had it as bad as the Jews, and I'm like, I don't know. I have Jewish ancestry, and there are like 2% of the population in this country that is indigenous, and there's like 7% of us that are Jews.
There's
7%? Seems like no, it's not that high, but it's also 2%. It's also like 2 or 3%.
Yeah.
But I was just like, and we're not the original inhabitants of this land, so it seems to me that the difference is actually that the Native American genocide was more complete. That you didn't succeed, but you came closer.
A big part of the genocide was by accident, in the sense that it was just diseases that Europeans had, which wiped out like 90% of the population to begin with. But if you my grandmother in the Holocaust, grandfather in the war, and his hometown was razed to the ground by the Nazis. and the stories, they wouldn't tell the stories because it's just too, it's crazy. Like, but the stories that I've heard, you cry. It's too brutal to understand the death and the destruction and the brutality that they were seeing, and the anyways. But you read the Native American stories of the residential schools, and it's the same fucking thing. There's no gas camp, but the child abuse, that's a Holocaust. Like that's the systematic same thing. It's a systematic, intentional destruction of a population. Whereas in the Jews was a physical extermination, but the Native Americans was a cultural extermination. But also,
I was gonna say we did a pretty good job of physical extermination here.
There's physical, yeah. There's, but yeah. Anyways,
or like there are none of the indigenous tribes of Newfoundland left. None of them. Like
and in Florida,
gone to a person.
Florida, yeah.
So well, that's the depressing note, but it's interesting to me how much has been hidden in coding, because I'm like, okay, so now we say, so when I was a kid we said African Americans, and now we say BIPOC, which is particularly strange. But
well, you're going back to colored people, which was the
old nomenclature, but now we're going back to where we privilege certain colored people over others in their thing. So it's black, then indigenous, then people of color. And
it's terrible because I hate this stuff, but when I see younger people, it's kind of like postmodernist gibberish. I absolutely hate postmodern gibberish. I think it's destroying everybody's minds. But then when I meet someone like whose first language isn't English, and they came as a student and just learned the way they learned English was in postmodernist gibberish, and then you see them talk, they use it in a very genuine way that doesn't have all that demented obscurantist intention, and you're like, okay, I guess this is okay. It's the same thing with all the language that I hate. There's a certain generation of people who are inculcated in that language that they're okay. They mean, it's like you could take a religion like Christianity. It could be the religion of crusades, or it could be the religion of vow of poverty. Just depends who's taking it. But yeah.
No, I'm with you. Like I don't think this rhetoric will matter, frankly. I mean, it just doesn't matter one way or the other. This is why I don't get all, like, I dislike it because with stuff like BIPOC, I'm like, okay, so you're trying to signal a privileging of certain kinds of people of color over others for reasons that I think even make sense. But in doing so, what you're doing is actually, okay, let's say you wanted to make a multiracial, anti-racist coalition, but by and there is anti-blackness in community and other communities of color, which I know you don't want to call racism because that would mess up your whole schema.
That everybody's human, which we don't want. Everyone's the same species, which we can't have.
So now we have to make it purely about anti-black bias, but it's anyway.
If you have a hierarchy in your coalition, you're defeating the coalition. Like a coalition is by its nature solidaristic. So when you are privileging some people over others, it's inherently corrosive to the coalition. I think that's all this liberal shit and all these acronyms and all this everything. That's what that is. It's like me, I need attention. It's like, well, no, right now we're fighting together. So you don't need it. The whole point is that you don't need attention right now. Your time is going to come, when something comes up, then we'll talk about you when it's relevant, but we're fighting together on this issue,
And that's the irony of the way intersectionality has come to be used. I mean, that's not its origins. I mean, its origins is like critical legal theory and understanding, like, well, sometimes discrimination is because you're both a woman and black. But
it's been used to hyper silo everybody into these mini categories. But I'm actually going to do a little bonus episode about Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, the article when she introduces intersectionality, because I think she talks about class later on in her career in a bit of a clumsy way. But if you see what she's doing something that makes sense. She's talking about like anti-discrimination law, would protect women and protect black people, but black women were being particularly affected by these layoffs and by the union seniority rules for historical reasons. So when there were layoffs, the black women just all completely got laid off. But as black women, they had no protection. And the courts ruled, well, women aren't being discriminated against. Black people aren't being discriminated against. And that's what the anti-discrimination legislation says. There's no category of black women. And we can't just open a Pandora's box of every micro identity, because everyone's just going to invent new identities to make themselves and 100% majority who's been fired. So we can't do that. So she's saying, no, we do have to focus on these, hybrid identities, because it's important. And then you're oppressed, not just as a woman, not just as a black person, but as a black woman. And that all sort of makes sense. But then when you're like, wait a second, if that lawsuit would have succeeded, it would have abolished seniority rules in the United States. And guess what? Seniority rules are the way that you fight discrimination and racism in a workplace. It's the pillar of any union contract, because if you're not laying people off by seniority, then you're laying people off according to whim, which means how much you kiss the boss's ass. Or if the boss is racist, then he'll fire you for being racist. And the unfortunate thing is, in that period of time, because it was just shortly after, like 15 years after the civil rights movement and a few years into the women's rights movement, black women got the short end of the stick for those historical reasons. But 10 years later, they would be the ones who would be the most protected by the seniority clauses. So basically, she was advocating for it, not on purpose, the same way Ibram Kendi isn't advocating for more white people to be homeless on purpose, but he is advocating for that without knowing it. She was advocating for destroying unions all across America, and the people who were bringing that lawsuit were inadvertently doing that. And I wonder who funded that lawsuit, but that's what happens when you ignore class.
Well, I mean, Abraham S. Kendi has actually said similar things, like, explicitly. And
like what? What do you mean? What do you say?
Like, he says that we should not have anti-discrimination rules at all, so that we can discriminate positively to remediate past injustice. Which
discrimination is, anyways. Yeah, but go on.
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, so, but how do you deal with, like, do you think just because people won't, like, discriminate against people like black people, that they aren't going to discriminate against, I don't know, sexual minority groups, or that sexual minority groups can't be racist if we like this is.
And if you allow positive discrimination without some kind of clear reason, well, guess what? Guess who's going to be the beneficiary of that within 10 years? White people. They're just going to positively find excuses to benefit. That's what you need, that legislation, so you don't have that.
Right. I mean, I always tell the story of a DSA chapter that I watched once that hit a gender quota problem. They had gone literally through all the women in the organization, putting them in the leadership to maintain their quota, and they were burning them out because they were putting them in the leadership immediately as soon as
they're not ready.
They're not ready.
Yeah.
To meet their quota. And then when they couldn't, they literally didn't have, none of the women would run, and because they'd already been burnt out.
Yeah.
And so they then started flirting with, and I'm serious, having straight cisgender men declare themselves non-binary because there's a policy of non-questioning, so they could meet the gender quota.
No, stop.
Real conversation that I saw.
Which DSA chapter is this? Or
my local one? I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, come on. Dude.
Now, I will also say that they didn't end up doing that. But that was the proposed answer until frankly a woman was like, that completely disputes the spirit of the law if that's what you're doing. And I'm like,
and also what you're doing there, the whole gender critical, like, turfy, you're just giving them you're telling them that, yes, everything that you ever say is correct. Like, that's literally what you're freaking out about, right? And that whole movement, it's weird. It's like some traumatized, I think there's a lot of traumatized people in that movement, and they have like a kernel of sense in there, but it's just like taken to crazy extremes. But now you're telling that your worst nightmare, your fantasy paranoid nightmare vision, PTSD vision of what you're screaming about is, here it is. This is worse than anything you guys are even talking about. This is holy shit.
I mean, and the thing is like, in general, in general society, that doesn't happen. That's like, this is a
bubble of like
a micro bubble. But it is funny because there isn't a way in which, like, you have two contradictory policies where you need gender quotas, but you also want to say that gender identity doesn't matter.
Doesn't exist. It doesn't matter.
Right.
Yeah.
So those policies are in direct contradiction with each other.
Yeah.
And
don't get me started on
yeah. And then when you throw all the women in your organization, regardless of whether they're cis or trans, and burn them out because you threw them in early to meet your quotas, and you have a 60% male organization, and instead of making your organization more attractive to women, you think that just putting them and having them reflected in leadership will fix the problem. Well, and you've burnt out all your female cadres in a local area already.
Yeah.
Well, then what do you got left? And it's going to lead to all kinds of shenanigans. I don't know that this has ever happened, but the fact that it was discussed and allowed in the bylaws was I was just like, what?
But never mind that insane proposal, which is a caricature movie, Daily Wire plus nightmare scenario proportions. It is also what you're telling me before is just that they burnt out all their women by shoving them into leader positions that they probably didn't want and weren't ready for. Like, you're not helping women by doing that. That's not good. And you have women, and I bet what happens with that is you have women who are not ready. They don't like what's happening. They're not good at what they're doing just because they don't have experience. And then you have an excuse for people to say, "Oh, look, women can't run an organization." You're just.
Right. So a lot of people respond to this right here, and they take this back, and when they become conservatives or post-leftists or whatever, they're just like, well, look at that.
Yeah.
And I said,
that's the equity stuff. That's the logic, and that's a legacy of postmodernism. Like, again, the postmodernism is like every perversion of good ideas. You take something good and you turn it into caca once it goes into the elite system, right? So the idea is that categories are not real, they're invented, or they're not entirely real. We need to be skeptical of categories. We need to think about them, not take them for granted. Becomes like it turns into, which is a good observation, and categories can reproduce power hierarchies that we don't like. Good observation. So let's pay attention to our categories. No, instead it's like throw away all the categories. Nothing means anything, but we still want them to mean something for some, because this has some advantage for like it's chaos. It's nonsense, and it becomes that kind of, how many lights? There are three. How many fingers? 3 fingers, right? There's 3 fingers, like that sort of Soviet torture stuff. Like it's all related. Like, and it is profoundly right-wing stuff. It is hierarchical stuff. It is authoritarian indoctrination. It is but it happens to be disguised in the language of racial justice, social justice, feminism, or communism in the sense of in the Maoists. That's the challenge of being on the left today, is making it clear that being on the left is not all this shit that's pretending to be on the left. We need to be able to distinguish between somebody who's on the left and somebody who is on the right disguised in left-wing costumes, and it's listen to what they say and listen to what they do and not what they say, and we need to have a definition of what left means for that to be coherent, because now left just means what people who pretend to be on the left, or people who declare to be themselves on the left. The left can't just be what people declare themselves as, because then every crazy person who thinks that they're Napoleon is Napoleon, and that's not you can't. No, words have to mean something. Let's figure out what we want them to mean and go from there. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. But what can people check out your work?
Oh, What is Politics is my YouTube channel. I'm just, because it's such a generic word, the way you can find it is podfollow, like podcast, podfollow.com/Worbs, WORBS, B like Bernie. And if you're on a desktop, that'll open the YouTube channel. If you're on a mobile device, it'll open up your podcast app. And I recommend the video versions if you have time to look at them, because all the jokes and there's so much content that's there that you won't get in the audio versions. And also if it's YouTube/whatispolitics69, I think you can get to that way. And that's about it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too.
See ya.
See you around.